In the summer of 1996, the whole of Belgium was in shock when two young girls who'd been kidnapped, raped and tortured were rescued from a makeshift dungeon below a house in Marcinelle. As the weeks passed, the bodies of four other young girls were found buried at properties linked to the same man.
Some of them starved to death, others were buried alive. These are some of the most horrendous crimes that any criminologist will ever come across.
It was the beginning of a terrible nightmare for the entire nation.
It was such a huge thing. No one could believe that such a person could exist in Belgium. It was unthinkable.
With the help of his wife, Michel Martin, convicted paedophile Marc Dutroux' unhealthy desire for young girls had turned deadly. The youngest victims who died in his homemade dungeon were just 8 years old.
It is unimaginable cruelty and something that sets Dutroux apart from some other serial killers.
Marc Dutroux, the man dubbed the Monster of Marcinelle, had earned his place as one of the world's most evil killers. It was a case that sent shockwaves across Europe. For a year during the mid-1990s, a Belgian killer had been abducting, torturing and raping young girls, keeping them chained inside his abandoned properties. It wasn't until the summer of 1996, when two of the young girls were found alive inside a basement in Marcinelle, that the Belgian public discovered the heinous crimes committed by Marc Dutroux.
Behind the facade of this perfectly ordinary-looking house lay a chamber of horrors. Down in that cellar, it's alleged that Dutroux built a cage to keep his victims. They were locked away like animals, raped repeatedly and mentally tortured.
But this killer's story begins over 60 years ago. Born in Ixelles on the 6th of November 1956, Marc Dutroux was the oldest of 5 children.
His parents were teachers and at one point emigrated to the Belgian Congo, where they taught. But when the crisis erupted in that country, they brought Dutroux back to Belgium in 1960.
His parents eventually separated in 1971, and 15-year-old Dutroux stayed with his mother.
We know that his mother was incredibly dominant, his father was very aggressive, so I think it was quite a hostile environment to grow up in. And I think those attachments, or lack of attachments, with his parents in those early years did play quite a role in the person he became.
Trained as an electrician but often unemployed, Dutroux soon began a long criminal history, including convictions for car theft, mugging and drug dealing.
Dutroux had a lot of contact with the police. He stepped up from car theft into a rather grand form of car theft, which involved shipping quite expensive luxury cars, which he'd stolen in Belgium, out of the country into Czechoslovakia and Hungary.
The profit from his crimes led to Dutroux owning 7 properties in and around the city of Charleroi, 45 miles south of Brussels. By 1983, 26-year-old Dutroux was married with 2 children, but he'd begun an affair with a schoolteacher called Michel Martin. The 23-year-old would eventually become Dutroux' partner in life and crime, with whom he also had 3 more children. The severity of Dutroux' crimes escalated from theft to sexual assault, and in 1989 he was found guilty of the abduction and rape of 5 young girls, one of whom was just 11 years old.
Marc Dutroux was a predator who selected his prey very carefully. He wanted to choose people who were easy to target in the first place, easy to abduct, but also easy to manipulate once he had them under his control. So he would go for the most vulnerable victims that he could find that fulfilled his desires.
Dutroux's now wife Michelle was found to be complicit in the abductions and served 2 years of a 5-year sentence.
The psychiatrists suggest that Martine and Dutroux, husband and wife, are a classic example of folie à deux, that one egged the other on, and that therefore the sum of the two of them was even more dangerous than one alone.
I think when we look at the relationship between Dutroux and his wife, who was implicated in many of his crimes, it is quite interesting. It's quite possible that some people see her as just another one of his victims, somebody else who was manipulated and coerced by him. And when we look at Marc Dutroux and his behaviour, he is incredibly charming at times, and he can be very persuasive. So it wouldn't surprise me if he'd set out with the intention of recruiting somebody to help him in his crimes, and this is somebody who fell for his charms and went along with it.
Dutroux was released on parole in 1992 after serving 3 years of a 13-year sentence, having shown good behaviour.
I find that extraordinary. You can be convicted of the rape and abduction of 5 girls, the youngest of which is 11, and you can walk out of jail after 3 years of a 13-and-a-half-year sentence.
Georges Wecano, a Belgian investigative journalist, has spent over 10 years reporting on the Dutroux case.
Dutroux is an expert manipulator. He made everyone cry. He made everybody believe that his family had abandoned him. As an exemplary prisoner, he came out very quickly. The prisons are overpopulated, and for authorities, he was nothing more than a car thief.
By the summer of 1995, Dutroux was a free man and living with his wife Michelle in one of his Charleroi homes in the suburb of Marcinelle. On the 24th of June, 2 8-year-old girls, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau, went missing from the town of Grasse-Hallange, just 55 miles east of Charleroi.
As there was no ransom request, no information about whether they had been kidnapped, probably they had been abducted by a predator, a paedophile, who, as in most cases, killed his victims to silence them. But who could imagine that a man was going to take away the girls, to keep them alive, locked alive inside a cellar? Nobody.
Dutroux, with the help of his wife Michelle, had abducted the 2 children and were keeping them prisoner inside a homemade dungeon.
Dutroux constructed a cell beneath his house in Charleroi, which was 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, and approximately 5 feet high, hidden behind a very strong, elaborate door, which was then covered with concrete and was hidden in his basement. He put these 2 8-year-old girls, Lejeune and Rousseau, into the cell and kept them there for the next 3 months.
As Julie and Melissa remained locked up in Dutroux's dungeon, his sexual depravity was escalating, and just 2 months later he would abduct 2 more girls, but this time it would lead to murder. On August the 23rd, over 100 miles away on the Belgian coast, 2 more girls disappeared. Best friends, 17-year-old Anne Marchal and 19-year-old Effia Lambrechts, had gone missing while on a camping trip. When the girls didn't return home, their friends instantly alerted Effia's father, Jean.
Ja, toen ze mij zeiden dus dat Effie niet terug thuis gekomen was.
We immediately had the feeling that something was wrong because she was always open about things. She always said where she was going and who she had seen. She would never not tell anyone and just stay away. That was not what Effia would do.
Gewoon wel bij achterblijven, dat was Effie haar toen niet.
The last reported sighting of Anne and Effia was at midnight in the central train station of Ostend, a coastal town in northern Belgium. Initially, the local police had dismissed the parents' concerns.
Ja, dus we waren...
They did not draw up a report. They said they must have gone out. They'll return soon. But during those first days, nothing was done. And afterwards, their friends contacted us. And we went to see the police at Hasselt. They did respond. And at that stage, the police at the coast started investigating. The police then asked questions. If she was, if perhaps she was addicted to drugs or something. My response was that Effia did not approve of those things. She was against it. I did not believe anything like that. But anyway, you start doubting. Or sometimes you start wondering, did I miss something?
Heb ik toch iets overhoofd gezien, maar ja, dat heeft er helemaal niks mee te maken.
And Marshall's father, Paul, went to visit investigative journalist Douglas de Koning to see if he could help.
I remember very well that Paul Marshall came into the office. He pleaded, please put a picture of my daughter on your front page. And I think we were laughing at him. He said, oh God, this poor man, his daughter is sure somewhere partying with some friends and she will show up in a few days.
But Anne and Effia were not out partying. In fact, Marc Dutroux, with the help of a man called Michel Lelièvre, had abducted, raped and murdered the two young women.
They were inveigled into the van that Dutroux used for the abductions. Because the dungeon beneath the house was full of the two 8-year-olds, they chained these two girls to a bed in the rest of the house. When exactly Marshall and Lembrick died, and precisely how, has always been a little mysterious. What is not in doubt is that they were tortured and raped and eventually strangled.
In December 1995, Dutroux was arrested in relation to a car theft. He was convicted and served almost 4 months in prison. During this time, the police searched his Marcinelle home. They were agonizingly close to finding out Dutroux's darkest secret.
Twice in December 1995, on the 13th and the 19th, police searched the house in Charleroi. One of the most poignant and tragic parts of that search, which included a search of the basement, was that the police failed to identify the dungeon. Even more horrifying, the two policemen who searched the house were accompanied by a locksmith who would help them. The locksmith told the policeman that he heard screams. The policeman said, oh, it must be from outside, and disregarded him. The terrible truth is that it was from the two 8-year-olds hidden in this cell, this dungeon.
At Dutroux's house, officers had also found several VHS cassette tapes, but investigators didn't watch them until much later.
There was a home video made by Marc Dutroux, where he was filming the development in the works in his child cage. This was essential proof that they were on the right track. But for some strange reason, they did this house search and they didn't exploit the information they got from it.
The police mistakes came at a fatal cost. By the time Dutroux arrived back home after his release from prison in March 1996, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo were dead. His wife, Michelle, had allowed the two 8-year-old children to starve to death in the makeshift dungeon.
Dutroux had told her to feed their large German Shepherd dog. Look after him. He neglected to tell Michelle, apparently, to feed the two 8-year-olds in the dungeon. Some say, in defense of Dutroux's wife, that she was so terrified of the whole idea of the dungeon and the fact that they might do something or she wouldn't be able to control them, meant that she couldn't go in, and so she therefore allowed them to starve to death. I've always regarded that as an over-benevolent description of what probably happened. But what I do believe is that between them, They allowed these children, 8-year-old girls, to suffer dreadfully, and there is no excuse in my mind for that.
Dutroux didn't wait long to find a replacement for the two girls. On the 28th of May 1996, he kidnapped 12-year-old Sabine Dardenne on her way to school and locked her in his dungeon. For the next 3 months, Dutroux emotionally tortured Sabine by making her think she was in contact with her mother and father.
She wrote letters to her parents, but obviously he didn't send the letters. He read them. He used what was in the letters to manipulate her, yet she resisted. Despite everything, she did not create that attachment with him.
Dutroux was still on the hunt for more girls. On August the 9th, he abducted 14-year-old Laetitia Delay as she walked home from her local swimming pool, before taking her back to his Marcinelle home to join Sabine Dardenne in the underground dungeon. But Laetitia's kidnapping would be the first step in the dramatic downfall of Marc Dutroux.
By accident, it was an eyewitness who saw her being bundled into a van on that day and got part of the number plate.
The man had seen a suspicious white van driving away from the swimming pool where Laetitia was last seen. A white Renault Traffic with a license plate beginning with the letters FFR. Prosecutor Michel Bourlet began to investigate.
Voilà, j'ai un début de plaque sur telle marque de voiture.
I had the beginning of a license plate and a make of car to work with. There were 20 names that matched, and the police officer said, among these 20 names there is a certain. And he said that with a Flemish accent because he was Flemish. Dutroux. This name sounds familiar. So I asked, who is this Dutroux? He's a man who lives in Charleroi, who owns a white van with a license plate beginning with the letters FFR, who was sentenced in 1989 on multiple abductions and rape charges to 13 years in prison, so he is a high-profile suspect.
Donc c'est un personnage important.
One of the police officers working with Michel had been involved in a separate investigation called Operation Othello, led by authorities in Charleroi looking into Dutroux's movements.
He provides us with all the information from that dossier, which he had been collecting since July 1995. We are currently in August 1996.
La cellule centrale de Bruxelles sur cet individu.
Investigator Michel and his partner Jean-Marc Connerot found even more damning information in the Othello file. The testimony of a man who'd been approached by Dutroux to help him kidnap girls.
He had asked a certain Claude Thiraud from the Charleroi region, who is also a fugitive who needed money. He said to him, "I'll pay you to help me abduct girls." But this guy was a police informant, so he went and told the gendarmerie. There's a guy named Marc Dutroux who lives there. He offered me money to kidnap children.
With such strong evidence, obviously Mr. Connerot and I decided immediately to take major action concerning Marc Dutroux.
Michel and his team were planning a synchronized raid on all 7 of Marc Dutroux's Charleroi homes. If they could find him, it may lead them to missing 14-year-old Laetitia Delhay. And there was a good chance that she may still be alive. But they needed to act fast. On the 13th of August, over 40 Special Ops police officers took part in a synchronized raid on all 7 of Dutroux's properties in Charleroi.
Donc je me trouve là vers 1h de l'après-midi au siège central.
At about 1 in the afternoon, I was at the headquarters of the gendarmerie of Charleroi at the very moment when Mr. Connerot received the news that in one of the properties in Salle-le-Bousier, Dutroux was found with his wife and the vehicle.
Avec la voiture.
This was the time to act, as it seemed that Dutroux was about to change the license plate on the van.
De changer la plaque du véhicule.
Dutroux, his wife Michel Martin, and an accomplice, Michel Lalièvre, were taken in for questioning. Over several hours of interrogations, all 3 maintained their innocence.
Chaque fois,
he was consistent in his lies, following each lie by telling another lie. It was a manipulative behaviour, but otherwise he stayed very, very calm.
Il est resté très serein, il ne paniquait pas.
Belgian authorities had no choice but to eventually release Lelièvre, who denied being with Dutroux on the day Laetitia was kidnapped. But moments after he left the police station in Charleroi, a startling witness account came through.
Les voisins de la maison de
The neighbours of his property in Marcinelle saw Marc Dutroux and Lelièvre return on Friday evening carrying a child covered by a blanket as they returned to his house, to Dutroux's house.
et qui sont rentrés chez lui, chez Dutroux.
Lelièvre was immediately rearrested and taken back into custody. As his accomplice's alibi began to crumble, Dutroux's interrogation took a drastic turn.
Quand Dutroux sait qu'on a une preuve,
Dutroux knows that we had proof that Laetitia was in the car, so he says, yes, I was in Beatrice, which he denied at the start. I met a young girl, I talked with her, and then she told me she was tired of her parents. Stories, because there are parts against him and he changes the stories to suit his narrative on the spot. Then, at the same time, Lelièvre said she was with Dutroux, and finally on Thursday, he ends up telling us, now that all of these parts of the story contradict each other, I will give you the two girls.
là, qui le contredisent. Il dit, je vais vous donner 2 filles.
Dutroux pointed to a poster inside the interrogation room of another missing girl, Sabine Dardenne. 12-year-old Sabine had been kidnapped by him in May.
2 days after his arrest, Dutroux confessed and took the police to the basement where Sabine and Laetitia were found alive.
On the 15th of August 1996, Dutroux led the investigators to his property in Marcinelle, where hidden behind a false wall in the basement was the dungeon where he'd been keeping Sabine Dardenne and Laetitia Delhaye locked up.
He pulled down the wardrobe and inside the cage behind was Sabine and Laetitia.
And then we got this, at that moment, incredible news that 2 kidnapped girls had been found alive in the cage of a person who had been convicted before for this kind of crimes.
It was such a huge thing. All the journalists were on the scene at the time. The news, magazines were there. It is as if there had been a terrorist attack. No one could believe that such a person could exist in Belgium. It was unthinkable.
C'était pas imaginable.
Laetitia, un sourire, s'il vous plaît. Merci. Ne vous inquiétez pas, je vais bien. Merci de m'avoir aidé. Merci beaucoup.
Douglas de Koninck was one of the few journalists who was allowed to enter Dutroux's basement.
We had seen pictures, we had been seen images, but being there is difficult to describe because it's like constructed to you wouldn't even put a dog in such a small place. This was really the kind of cage they made to hide guns from the police.
As Belgium awoke in shock to the news that a man from Marcinelle had abducted, raped and tortured 2 girls over several months, the families of Sabine Dardenne and Laetitia Delhaye rejoiced that their daughters had been found alive.
They are rare occasions when we find the relatives and a policeman or a magistrate has the opportunity to return a child who have been kidnapped in such circumstances alive. It's fantastic, obviously. It is a joy that can be shared with the parents.
Over the next 48 hours, investigators continued to relentlessly question Dutroux. They were desperate to find the 2 8-year-old girls, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau, who'd been missing for more than a year.
Marc Dutroux was playing a game with his investigators. He knew that he never would get out of prison anymore. He knew that he would be presented as the most famous criminal we've ever had in Belgium. And he wanted to exploit that situation.
He had to be flattered. They had to make him believe that they believed his pitiful story, make him believe that things were not that bad for him. It's true that you were ingenious on this one. You were not caught, and you fooled the police, and here and there. At that point, his ego had been flattered, and little by little he let information slip. That's his attitude.
After 48 hours of this cat-and-mouse game, Marc Dutroux finally revealed to investigators that he had abducted the two 8-year-old girls. Officer Jean-Pierre Adam was in the interrogation room.
As he did not say he had killed them, we hoped they would be alive. We had to go fast. It could have been a matter of life or death for them. They could very well have been left there without food or drink.
But there was no happy ending this time. In the back garden of Dutroux's house in Marcinelle, police found the bodies of Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo.
I'll remember all my life the moment that I learned that we had found the bodies of Julie and Melissa. It was disappointing because we always hoped to find them alive. It was a great moment of solitude. Yeah, I put myself in the place of the parents. For them, it is 100,000 times worse. But even for me and my colleagues, who were looking for the right information, well, we were extremely disappointed.
I can only imagine what the parents of Lejeune and Rousseau must have felt. I mean, not only have their daughters disappeared, but they're allowed to starve to death and are then unceremoniously shoved in a bin bag and buried in the garden. It is unimaginable cruelty and something that sets Dutroux apart from some other serial killers.
Despite the bodies of both girls being found buried in the garden of his house, Dutroux denied both abducting and killing them.
Well, it's not me who took them away. It's not my fault if they died. I was in prison. Yes, that's what he said to me. It's Martin who should have fed them, who did not come to feed them.
The police also found the body of a Frenchman named Bernard Weinstein buried in Dutroux's garden. It's believed that he helped Dutroux kidnap Julie and Melissa in June 1995. Back in the police station, the paedophile soon confessed to abducting another two girls.
In the meantime, we also had a fairly rapid confession about the abduction of Anne and Effia on the Belgian coast.
It was the news that Effia's father, Jean, had been dreading.
To begin with, we were not told anything. Then the police started asking questions. If we had any more people, children, if he'd been involved with more children. Finally, Dutroux also admitted that he had Anne and Effia.
Dutroux pointed investigators to a property in the Jumet district of Charleroi, owned by Bernard Weinstein, the accomplice whose body had just been found in Dutroux's back garden in Marcinelle. On September the 3rd, 1996, near a shack not far away from the house, police exhumed the bodies of Anne Marchel and Effia Lambrechts. They had been missing for over a year. Post-mortem results revealed the pair had been buried alive.
At that time, it was only then that people began to make more or less the connection between everything. No one had made the link.
The nation was completely stunned. Between 1995 and 1996, Marc Dutroux, a convicted child abuser, had abducted and raped 6 young girls aged between 8 and 19 years old. 4 of them were now dead.
For him, his fantasy was to take young girls. He soon realised that Julia and Melissa were sexually too young for him, so he took ones that were a little older. That was Anne and Effia. But he found that they were too difficult to manage because they were older, stronger, more intelligent. There was one that escaped several times. He had to catch her again, and it became unmanageable for him, so he killed them as well. In his crazy and depraved mind, the first ones were too young, the others were too old. He chose in between, so he first took Sabine and then Letitia.
These are some of the most horrendous crimes that any criminologist will ever come across. But this is somebody who just wouldn't have felt bad about his victims at all. He has no sense of connection to them or empathy with them.
Due to the size of the ongoing investigation, it would take 7.5 years before Dutroux, Martin and their accomplice Michel Lelièvre were finally taken to trial. During those years, the sheer gruesomeness of Dutroux's crimes, coupled with the major shortcomings of police investigations, led to widespread protests across the country.
It's as if something falls on your head and you say to yourself, but how did we not see it? How did we not see it happen? Those events deeply shook society. You wondered what we're going to build tomorrow on.
Dutroux's case had grabbed the headlines of every news outlet in Belgium and had become an international story. Belgian society was on the verge of breaking point. The trial against Marc Dutroux, his wife Michelle, and an accomplice, Michel Lelièvre, was due to begin on the 1st of March 2004, nearly 8 years after the bodies of 4 girls had been found in 2 properties linked to Dutroux. By the time the trial arrived, the story had become one of the biggest controversies in Belgian history.
Belgian society still remains deeply divided over whether they've got the right people in the dock and just how thoroughly the case has been investigated.
On espère qu'on va trouver un peu la vérité et on espère certainement que c'est possible.
We lived and went to sleep with this trial. It was like an addiction. There were so many pages in the newspaper, so many hours on television.
The prosecution had brought over 200 charges against Dutroux and his accomplices.
There was the kidnapping, the abduction, rape and murder of young girls. So if you multiply that by 4 or 5, so there were roughly 235, 255 charges attributable to him.
The trial began on March the 1st, 2004 at the Arlon-Assise court in southeast Belgium. Dutroux pleaded guilty to the murder of his French accomplice, Bernard Weinstein, but denied kidnapping 8-year-olds Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo, and killing camping friends Anne Marchel and Effie Lambrex.
He continued to deny kidnapping Julie and Melissa, and he also denied the fact that he had killed Anne and Effie. But the most important thing, with regards to the kidnapping of Julie and Melissa, he said, "The death of Julie and Melissa is not my fault. I was in prison."
He said one was already deceased and the other practically dead. He tried, he said. That's what he said, to save her, but he could not do it. He could not do it, so he buried them.
As the prosecution began to make its case, the most gruesome details of Dutroux's crimes were laid bare in front of the eyes of the jury and of the families of the girls.
Het kwam mij dadelijk over dat het niet volledig was, dat ze gewoon Dutroux...
They asked about the photos, how they had been found. Photos had been taken, and I left the courthouse. I did not look at those photos. They were too horrible.
Toegedekt was, dat er niet meer achter weet gekomen is.
True that it's very dramatical to be there, because we have to see again everything that was not so easy to see and to accept.
The testimony of kidnapped 12-year-old Sabine Dardenne, now aged 20, described how Dutroux had repeatedly raped her during the 80 days she was held prisoner inside Dutroux's dungeon.
Je me dis qu'il y a plein de gens qui peuvent plus parler, il y a plein de gens qui veulent entendre et ça m'a fait du bien de mettre les points sur les i, vu qu'il y avait eu aussi des histoires il y a plusieurs années comme quoi je disais pas la vérité, ça m'avait pas plu du tout. Et j'espère qu'aujourd'hui tout le monde m'a cru.
For 14 weeks, the self-obsessed psychopath used the courtroom as his stage, communicating with his captive audience from behind the glass cage where he was made to sit for his own protection.
I started to understand him better just by hearing him talking in direct. For example, one of the moments I never forget was the airco didn't work anymore. It was terribly hot. in that courtroom, and there were some people saying we cannot go through with this. We should stop today and wait until the plumber has arrived. And then suddenly Marc Dutroux knocked on his glass and said, "I can fix it." And he started a whole explanation about what was wrong with the system and how to fix it. And he just had to be released from his box and he would do it.
Marc Dutroux is a textbook psychopath, in my opinion. And when we look at psychopathy, these are people who are not as emotionally complex as the rest of us. They don't have that same depth of feeling. They lack a conscience. They operate pretty much like robots. So they are able to kind of live in the present, to just simply follow their own wants and desires. But I think one important thing to remember about psychopaths is they're not mentally ill. They are rational, they're aware of what they're doing, their actions are the result of choice.
What many found so disturbing was the role of Dutroux's wife Michelle, who became a silent witness and at times accomplice to his heinous crimes.
Michel Martin.
This Michelle Martin, she's a total riddle because she's different. She's not like Dutroux. I think if she had not met Dutroux, she might not have done what she did. And here she also tried to explain. She regretted it. But it's so strange that as an explanation, she was going to feed the dog, and in the house, the kids were downstairs, yet she did not go to them. How can people live with themselves? It's not them who created the horror, but the fact that they can live alongside it.
C'est pas eux qui ont créé l'horreur, mais ils peuvent vivre avec à côté.
Dutroux's defense lawyers argued that he was part of a Europe-wide paedophile network.
It was very weird because Marc Dutroux had changed his lawyers on several occasions, and now he showed up with 4 lawyers, with each a different defense line. There was one saying he's a psychopath. Don't listen to all these stories about networks, criminal organization behind him. No, it's him alone. And there was this other lawyer saying he's part of a big network. He's just the guy who kidnaps girls, brings them to sex parties and cleans up the mess.
But the jury ruled out the involvement of others, and on June the 17th, 2004, they found Marc Dutroux guilty.
To all the charges that I brought against Dutroux, the jury answered positively.
Question numéro 9, oui. Question numéro 11, oui. Question numéro 13, oui.
Well, there was not much suspense because you could feel how, no matter how the jury was critical towards the official story, it was clear that they would condemn Marc Dutroux for every accusation.
On the 22nd of June 2004, Marc Dutroux was given the maximum life sentence. His wife, Michelle Martin, received 30 years in prison, and Michel Lelièvre 25 years for his part in the crimes. Despite the 4-month trial, there are still many questions left unanswered in the Dutroux case.
For example, the exact locations, as well Julie and Melissa, as Anne and Eve, their parents, until today, they don't know where it happened. And it's crucial because if you want to determine responsibilities, to know what exactly happened, that's what these parents is promised, what they absolutely want, just a convincing explanation of what happened. They never got that.
Ja, ik dacht aan meer gerechtigheid.
I was hoping for more justice, so that we'd know who we were dealing with. And also, what happened to Effia? How was she murdered? And that we still don't know. We do not know the details, so we have never found out how she died.
We hebben nooit geweten hoe ze aan haar einde gekomen is.
Dutroux's wife, Michelle, was controversially released from prison on August the 28th, 2012. She now lives in hiding under protection from the Belgian authorities.
Dutroux asked to be released on the grounds that he'd seen in the light that he was no danger to anybody anymore, that after all they released his wife, why couldn't they release him? The request was refused and he is in solitary confinement.
Marc Dutroux has continued to deny killing the 4 girls and despite pleas from the families and the survivors, has never given an explanation for his actions. Many people believe his crimes spread further and wider, and that there were other accomplices involved, leaving some with a feeling that justice had not been served.
We did not get any answers, and we started our own investigation. We examined dossiers ourselves. We found out some things, but much more is still unclear.
The fact that this was a case of child abduction, this was a case where the violence used against children was so evident, so uncommon, that it was hard to believe that this guy not only was released from prison after only a few years, but managed to find a way to start immediately again with kidnapping girls, buying houses, and he was like everything that could be worse was worse.
Dutroux's crimes not only affected the families of his victims, the entire country was sickened by this deadly psychopath.
Unfortunately, Dutroux is the one thing that Belgium would not want to be remembered for. In the years between 1996 and 98, 1/3 of the Belgian people whose name was Dutroux asked to change their name. It is a commentary on how deeply affected the country was by this lone wolf.
Well, some of the things that Marc Dutroux did were incredibly depraved, and he didn't seem to have any bad feelings about that. He completely lacked any empathy for his victims. He treated his victims essentially as commodities, as items to use and discard when he was fed up with them.
He is depraved. There are no physical signs. He's a man who, if you meet on the street, you'll meet him. He doesn't stand out. But when you analyse his personality, it's that of a depraved man, that's all. An intelligent man who knows what he wants, but is depraved.
He's a psychopath, someone who has no feelings for people. He thinks he can reconstruct his fantasies. He believes that he is going to kidnap 2 girls away and that they will become attached to him and that they will love him. He will grow old with them. One must be seriously disturbed to think that.
Marc Dutroux's hideous crimes left many families in mourning and a whole nation stunned. By manipulating those around him, he was able to satisfy his depraved sexual urges. We may never know the truth about how far and wide Dutroux's network of crime spread, or how many children may have suffered in his homemade dungeon. But we can be sure that Marc Dutroux will never be free to cause harm to anyone ever again. For 3 decades, a relentless serial killer was targeting women across the industrial heartland of West Germany. Between 1955 and 1976, he confessed to killing at least 14 victims, the youngest of them a 4-year-old girl. But the authorities had no idea.
The fact that he got away with this for so long, I think we should really ask ourselves a lot of questions. How does somebody like this go under the radar for that long?
He killed with such stealth that others were blamed for his murders.
Everyone kept saying he was the alleged child murderer, and that drove my father to his death.
In 1976, the police captured the actual killer, a 43-year-old man named Joachim Kroll. He demonstrated how he'd killed his victims in a series of chilling reconstruction pictures.
In my view, Kroll is among the most depraved serial killers we've seen in Europe in the 20th century.
Joachim Kroll, the man dubbed the Duisburg Cannibal, had carved his place in history as one of the world's most evil killers. It was a series of murders that shocked the whole of Germany. For 21 years between the mid-1950s and the mid-70s, Joachim Kroll murdered at least 14 people by strangling them to death. His youngest victim, Marion Ketter, was just 4 years old. The discovery of her dismembered body in the summer of 1976 left the nation in a state of complete disbelief. For years, Kroll took care to strike away from his home in Duisburg, a town in the Ruhrgebiet, West Germany's industrial heartland. But Marion Ketter lived right on his street. Police were knocking on doors, searching for the missing 4-year-old girl in July 1976, when they made a gruesome discovery. Bernd Jägers was a young detective on the Duisburg murder squad.
The whole thing was only discovered because Achim took a girl from the neighborhood. Before that, he would travel further and the crime scenes were far away from Duisburg. That is the reason why it took us so long to catch him. This time he took a girl from the neighborhood who he knew by sight. He took her to his flat, sexually abused her, and then killed her. When a 4-year-old goes missing, the alarm bells go off everywhere. Of course, you use a lot of personnel to try and find this girl. And when we got there, other colleagues were already on the scene. And we then went inside the flat and experienced something terrible.
The story of this twisted killer begins more than 80 years ago. Joachim Kroll was born on April 17, 1933, the 6th of 9 children. His family lived in Upper Silesia, in the far east of Germany, until they got driven out at the end of the Second World War.
Joachim Kroll was the son of a coal miner, born in East Germany, weakly, unprepossessing child, barely intelligent. He had an IQ of 79.
Man lebte in sehr beengten räumlichen Verhältnissen.
They lived in very cramped circumstances. Only 2 rooms for a family of 11, always in financial difficulties.
Und auch das Verhältnis
and also his relationship with the family weighed heavily on him because he was hardly able to develop any kind of close relationship with his siblings.
Zu seinen Geschwistern aufbauen konnte. Joachim
Kroll was lonely in his own family because he learned that he didn't matter much as a human.
Als Mensch nicht so sehr gezählt wird.
He didn't experience any motherly or fatherly love at home and therefore couldn't develop a feeling of self-worth.
Für die eigene Person
he was withdrawn and shy.
War immer sehr
he was afraid to even speak because he was physically abused.
Mitzuteilen, weil es dann Strafen gab.
He was a bit of a victim, a bit of an outcast, even within his own family. And then when he went to school, he didn't really fit in there either. He had quite a low IQ. He wasn't particularly bright. He was a bit slow. So that made him a bit of a target there. And then later on, he was drafted into the Hitler Youth. You know, perhaps his father thought this was a way of sorting him out and making him, you know, a real man. But that didn't really work out either because he didn't fit in with that particular culture. So here's somebody who's always been something of an outsider, somebody who doesn't always fit in, who isn't really accepted anywhere.
Als die Rote Armee kam,
when the Red Army came, all the Germans were driven out. And for the Kroll family, it was an odyssey, because they went from place to find another home somewhere. Kroll had to watch women being raped, people being killed, how small boys played with explosives and blew themselves up in the process. So, as a young man, Joachim Kroll had already been badly traumatized.
Junger Mann, stark traumatisiert worden.
You have to bear in mind that Achim had always been teased and bullied. Even in his own family, he was always the loser. When one of them did something, his siblings would always say, Achim did it, so he would be beaten again.
There's quite a few pieces of the jigsaw puzzle falling quite neatly into place here for Kroll. So he started off life as an outsider, not really got many decent social relationships. He's quite isolated, and he's somebody who is becoming increasingly introverted, and that's always a dangerous thing.
While working on farms as a teenager, Kroll was regularly beaten by his superiors whenever he made a mistake.
He went to work on a farm, quite a tough environment. He didn't get on particularly well socially in this environment. He worked with people on the farm. This included women who he would make inappropriate passes at because he just didn't have the social skills to form normal relationships with the opposite sex. He was quite aggressive in his approach to them. So he was often rejected by the women that he would try and develop relationships with. And I think that served to just isolate him even further.
During his time on the farm, Kroll also developed a morbid fascination with the butchery of animals.
Back in those days, slaughtering animals on farms isn't the kind of cold, clinical approach that's taken today. It was incredibly brutal, it was incredibly bloody. He wasn't repulsed by these scenes of gore and blood and violence that other people might be.
Als zum ersten Mal das Schlachten eines Schweines beobachtet.
When he saw a pig being slaughtered for the first time, it had a lasting effect on him. He started sweating, his pulse was racing. It was basically a very positive and almost ecstatic experience that he didn't expect to feel. He was completely overwhelmed by these sensations that were totally unknown to him.
In die unvermindert hineingeschleudert wurde, weil Joachim Kroll so etwas ja vollkommen fremd war.
So he's a bit different, and he's developing a tolerance to violence and to death.
Kroll's delight in the blood and gore of the slaughterhouse even manifested into sexual acts with animals.
In der Pubertätzeit, und war in der Pubertät, als bei den Bauern war.
If fantasies of sexual violence developed during puberty, and he was in puberty, when he was working on farms, then you can never get rid of them. There he experienced these sexual things which aroused him, the warm blood, and where he satisfied himself. Then afterwards he lived out his fantasies on the animals, with sexual acts, with cows and anything that was available. And something like that will never go away.
When we look at sex, we look at what is it? What does it represent? Essentially, it represents power. Now, here's somebody who hasn't had a lot of power, who hasn't had a lot of control over the things that have been happening in his life. But when he's involved in the slaughtering of animals, he's fully in control in this situation. And this is something that he quite enjoys. It's the first time, I think, in his life that he's got control over what's going on.
Kroll's fantasies translated into behaviour that was becoming more and more grotesque.
When he lived in a hostel for single men and he took a cat into his room, he had this idea that he wanted to see what the insides looked like.
He took a hammer, struck the cat and skinned it, and took a closer look at its intestines.
And that really does show this kind of childlike curiosity that he's got and the complete lack of boundaries around how to behave appropriately.
His violence towards animals took a more human-like turn when Kroll began experimenting with blow-up dolls.
Weil Kroll keinen Zugang zu Frauen
Because Kroll didn't manage to get access to women, he procured himself several rubber dolls instead, which he draped with clothing, but then also hanged them with a rope and imagined that the women would then die. He got a particular kick out of that.
Das gab für ihn dann den besonderen Kick.
It was only a matter of time before Kroll's perverse behaviour would lead him to kill. When he was arrested 3 decades later for the gruesome murder of 4-year-old Marion Ketter in July 1976, the police found communication with Kroll extremely difficult.
Well, we just simply thought if someone does something like this, other things or fantasies must have played a part.
Kroll was so withdrawn the police decided he might open up more if just one detective tried to form a rapport with him.
I said to our boss I would like to talk to Aki Malone. So the two of us sat down in the interview room and I tried, with absolute mundane and trivial subjects, to get through to him. To get through to this man now was, of course, not easy. I then tried with something we found out through interviews with his neighbours, that he would often work on the moped that he owned, that he would fix it and adjust it, that he also repaired his own television. And so I tried to go down this route, and all of a sudden I noticed that he realised someone's listening to me. When I talk about myself, it is actually asking questions. And that was the moment when trust was gradually built up, where I was fortunate enough to kindle a spark of trust, and so he also discussed other things with me.
Vielleicht jetzt das Glück hatte, in ihm so ein bisschen Vertrauen auch zu erwecken, dass mit mir dann auch die anderen Sachen besprochen hat.
Kroll was ready to talk to the police. They had no idea that the quiet man sitting before them was responsible for the barbaric killing of at least 14 people over the past 21 years. His confession would stun the whole of West Germany. As detectives continued with their interrogations, Kroll began to open up.
Mein Kollege Bernd Jägers hat alles richtig gemacht.
My colleague Bernd Jägers did it all the right way. He's the one who broke the ice. Because without his special relationship with Kroll, all these murder confessions would probably never have been possible. So therefore, he deserves the very highest respect. He gave Kroll the feeling, I don't see you as a beast or man-eater, but just as a human being, and that's exactly how I'll treat you. Let yourself go, do that. And Kroll did that. And then day after day, he confessed to new murders.
Neue Mordgeständnisse vorgetragen.
Kroll told detectives he'd committed his first murder when he was 21 years old in February 1955, just 3 weeks after the death of his mother.
Die mörderische Karriere von Joachim Kroll begann kurz nachdem
Joachim Kroll's murderous career started when the only person he could relate to, his mother, died. His mother was, above all, the most important person in Kroll's life, in contrast with his father, who beat him regularly. She was the only positive figure in his life. He looked up to her and didn't have to be afraid. So when this pillar broke, there was no halt to his sexual pathological development.
Leben weggebrochen war. Dann gab es also auch für seine sexualpathologische Entwicklung kein Halten mehr.
The victim was 19-year-old Irmgard Striel. Kroll had attacked her in the town of Ludinghausen, an hour's drive northeast of Duisburg.
So he sees this woman and he tries to make a pass at her, to grab her and kiss her. And understandably, she doesn't react well to this.
Das hat ihn so stark
That rejection stunned him so much that he thought, I'm a human being and I want to live my sexuality, so I have to find another way. And so violence was the only solution.
As a result, he kind of shuffles her off into the woods where he sexually assaults her and he kills her, and then he mutilates her body. So this is somebody who appears to be, you know, kind of subhuman in a way. When we put his first murder in context, the only way that he's felt powerful and that he's felt in control is when he's been killing animals on the farm. So when he kills his first victim, this is another exercise of power, it's another exercise of control. But what's particularly important about this one is that he's crossed a line. He's killed a human being, he's killed an individual, and I think this is a line that he will cross time and time again.
Kroll began to confess to a murderous career that had lasted for the previous 21 years. He had developed a familiar MO, sneaking up behind people and strangling them to death.
Kroll was one of the few people who almost fulfilled the stereotype of a serial killer. He did have slightly staring eyes and a small, rather weaselly, rat-like face. He tended to be furtive in all his movements. He targeted women, but they had to be inert. Well, the only way that Kroll could be assured that his female victims were inert was to kill them. He would strangle them rapidly, often by surprise, usually in isolated places. He was the sort of chap you probably would have wanted to cross the street to avoid.
The main effect of strangulation is that it blocks the blood supply to the brain and it blocks the blood coming back from the brain to the body. That's far more immediately damaging than pressure on the windpipe or blocking off the air supply. So once you've blocked the blood supply to the brain, once the arteries aren't supplying it with blood, you've literally got about 10 seconds before you lose consciousness, so it's quick.
As Detective Bernd Jägers continued with his daily interrogation of Kroll, the story began to captivate the German press, who dubbed the killer the Duisburg Cannibal.
His nickname at one point was the Ruhr Cannibal, or the Ruhr Hunter, because he regularly boasted, in the wake of his capture, that he ate the victims. He said it was the only meat he could eat.
You have to explain that back then there were all kinds of stories published in the press, wild stories, none of which were true. Let's say the Bild Zeitung published interviews word for word in the newspaper, but we never actually talked to the Bild Zeitung. They published such things as, now Achim Kroll is being given cake or potato fritters, so that he will confess to the next murder. This is, of course, total nonsense. Now we were there every day, also at the weekends, in order to keep Joachim's spirits up. So I just asked him, what would you like to eat? Which is quite normal. He would say, I would like a piece of cake. Then, of course, we would go and get cake. But that was just about being human, and not to get a murder confession. No one would confess to murder because of that.
Das muss man sich ja vorstellen. In den Medien wird...
You have to imagine, Kroll is built up in the media as a monster, a man-eater, a cannibal, and then the police go and serve him with his favorite food. In the end, it was also just a tactic to get Kroll to talk. And using these means has to be allowed.
Zum Sprechen zu bringen. Und diese Mittel müssen dann erlaubt sein.
Having gained the confidence of Kroll, the police got a clear insight into the perverse fantasies that ultimately motivated him to commit his appalling crimes.
He needed this killing. He needed this seeing how to kill, and that gave him sexual gratification. But the corpses in themselves no longer interested him. He just left them. He did not cover them up, nothing at all. And then he got the bus or train or whatever home in a completely normal way.
Kroll tended to minimise his behaviour, and as criminologists we call this techniques of neutralisation. So rather than describing them as the horrendous things they are, he described them as his funny feelings, you know, something that was a bit of a quirk, something that was a bit odd. So he's minimising what he's doing by describing it in that way.
Between 1955 and 1976, Kroll told detectives that he'd killed at least 14 people and that he could take them to some of the crime scenes. Officers decided to drive him to a series of cold case locations throughout the Ruhrgebiet region. They hoped by allowing him to reenact the murders, it may help them identify his unknown victims. The police captured photographs of these macabre reconstructions.
We as interrogators had no files, nothing at all. We drove behind them. They stopped somewhere. Then Achim got out and we asked, Achim, have you been here before? And if he recognized something, then he said, yes, I have been here before. He then looked at it all and went with us into the forest, depending on what crime scene it was. He then could describe how it had looked at that time. That was incredible. He had a photographic memory. He did not know where he was, but he just had this photographic memory.
Kroll would try and identify a specific tree or shrub, but he couldn't always find what he was looking for.
We would find a few places where a forest used to be, but now there were high-rise buildings. Then he didn't know anymore and he said, I'm sorry, I can't say if I was here. I don't know. Of course, this was sometimes frustrating, but you have to live with that after such a long time.
Kroll took the police to the town of Essen, half an hour's drive from his home in Duisburg, where he told them how he killed 61-year-old Maria Hetken outside of her house in 1969.
He walked around the lake all day. It was nice weather and had this feeling. It slowly turned to dusk and he wanted to go home, but then he saw the old lady whom he immediately addressed and said, "Do you want to have sex with me?" She did not want to, of course. He snatched her and pulled her into a wooded area, and then he killed her there.
He doesn't seem to have a particular victim type, which is something that we do tend to see in serial killers. So this could suggest that his crimes are completely opportunistic, that he's not consciously targeting a particular group of people.
Using the information gathered in these fact-finding missions, the police were able to piece together Kroll's history of murder.
Wir konnten also nur von dem, was Achim Kroll uns bei der Rekonstruktion gezeigt hatte.
We could only use what Achim Kroll told us during the reenactment, during the interrogation. And we would ask a few questions about whether or not anything more had occurred. Or we asked, "Achim, what did you do then? What happened then?" Questions like that. These answers convinced us that he's not inventing this stuff and that he really wants to get it off his chest. After spending 3 months with Achim and looking into more than 100 cases, at some point the defense said, "That's enough. Achim Kroll will no longer go into the car with the police." So we could not continue to go to all the unsolved crime scenes. This may have also resulted in solving other unsolved cases. That was a shame.
Das war schade.
As new crimes were revealed to detectives, they soon realized that Kroll was confessing to murders that had already been solved. Some of these innocent men who had been wrongly accused were in prison, and some had even ended up dead. He had confessed to the murder of 14 people and led detectives to the location of many of the crime scenes. One of these victims was 13-year-old Jutta Rahn. Kroll had strangled and killed her in the town of Breitscheid in 1970, 6 years before his arrest. But in a time before DNA evidence existed, the police had focused their investigation on Jutta's boyfriend.
For the
police and also for the prosecutor, the matter was resolved. And because of that, it was not on the list. And then Achim went with us into the forest and explained what he had done. This was the first story where we then said, "Hey, we have somebody here who is in the know. We're not here with somebody who is not quite so clever." He wants to show us what he's done. And now we have a crime for which someone else has almost been sentenced. And he has another 20 to 30 people that he might have killed.
A blood group classification expert later confirmed that Jutta's boyfriend could not have been the perpetrator, and he was acquitted. But he was not the only man who had been mistakenly accused of a Kroll murder. One man had even made a false confession about killing 16-year-old Manuela Knort, who was in fact murdered by Kroll in 1959.
Der ist zur Polizei nach einiger Zeit gekommen und hat gesagt, ich habe dieses Mädchen umgebracht.
After some time, this man went to the police and told them that he killed this girl. He really went to prison for the crime, but then said during his trial, "It wasn't me. I only said that because I had financial problems, family problems. I was on the street. I needed somewhere to go and confess to this crime." It was, of course, no longer treated as an unsolved case by the police. The case had been closed. It had come to a trial and he had been convicted.
Weil ist ja zu einer Gerichtsverhandlung gekommen. Ist dann auch verurteilt worden.
Following Kroll's arrest in 1976, the convicted man wrote an astonishing letter which was published in the press.
This
man had already turned to our boss at the murder squad. He wrote a letter then saying that he was not the perpetrator and that the perpetrator must still be walking around free. We went to that scene, to the crime scene, and Achim got out and said, "Yes, I was here too." He went into the forest and again looked for a very specific bush and a specific place, and he said here it was, and we immediately did a reconstruction. So that was the second story, where an innocent person had served time in prison and the matter was considered as solved.
Another man who was falsely accused was Walter Kwicker, a farmer from Walsum, a suburb of Duisburg. He lived less than a mile from the spot where 11-year-old Monika Tafel was killed in June 1962.
Das junge Mädchen war an diesem Tag zufällig unterwegs.
The young girl happened to be out and about that day and bumped into Joachim Kroll, who was out looking for a new victim to kill and rape. Without the slightest hesitation, he kept turning around to check if anyone could see him, approached the girl, dragged her into a field, strangled her, and then sexually assaulted her.
But in 1962, Joachim Kroll was just a phantom. And a few days after the brutal killing of Monika Tafel, the police arrested Walter Kwiecka. His daughter Marlies was just 6 years old at the time.
Man hat meinen Vater verdächtigt, 150 Meter von seinem Elternhaus.
My father was suspected of raping and murdering an 11-year-old girl 150 meters from his family home.
Von den Bewohnern des Ortsteils, aber auch aus seinem Bekanntenkreis.
People who lived in the area, and also from among his acquaintances, made claims, expressed suspicions which the police reacted to. And I think it was 5 days after the child's body was found, they arrested him at his workplace.
Das konnte ihn da keiner gesehen haben.
No one could have seen him, because on the day of the disappearance he was at work, so in that sense he also had a kind of alibi. He was accused, and I know that some people who were very close to me made negative comments about my father.
Über meinen Vater.
The murder of Monika had left the community in a state of shock. People were keen to keep their children within sight because no one knew where the killer lived or when he'd strike again.
Und dadurch war eine beklemmende Stimmung im Ortsteil.
This created an oppressive atmosphere in the area, and at the same time people voiced their suspicions. One person suspected the next. It was a hard time for everyone. And no one insisted that it wasn't him. The accusations were there. Apart from my mother, she always said it wasn't him.
Walter was only held in police custody for a few days before being released without charge. But people in the area continued to see Marlies' father as the killer.
Also nachdem freigelassen worden ist.
So after he was released, people avoided him, and people called out behind him, "Murderer," and stuff like that. It was the case that people really avoided him in the area.
Just 6 months after his arrest, the false accusations became too much for Walter to take.
Am 10. Dezember hat abends das Haus verlassen.
On the evening of the 10th of December, he left the house, and that was the last time he was seen. On the 15th of December 1962, he was found hanging from a tree by some children.
Ich habe das mit 9 Jahren richtig kapiert, was vorgefallen war, und es hat mich
I was 9 years old when I really grasped what had happened, and it appalled me. It touched me inside, and I often stood and looked at the spot where the girl was murdered.
Wo das Mädchen ermordet wurde.
When Kroll confessed to the murder of 11-year-old Monika Tafel following his arrest in 1976, it came as a huge relief to Marlies. But in a way, Walter Kwiecka had become yet another victim of Joachim Kroll.
Es kam der Ausspruch meiner Großmutter, dann war es ja doch nicht. Dieser Ausspruch hat
My grandmother came out with the remark, "So it wasn't him after all." This remark affected me very deeply, and I didn't ever discuss it with anyone else because I had to process the fact that the pressure of being the daughter of a suspected murderer had disappeared.
Tochter eines angeblichen Kindermörders zu sein, verschwunden war. Für mich war es so, mein Vater war rehabilitiert.
My father had been rehabilitated. I don't know what other people said about that afterwards. I only know what I heard and what I felt myself. And that's the only thing that counted for me.
Und das allein zählte für mich.
Before Kroll was arrested, a whole series of other men came under suspicion as part of the investigations. And that is, of course, particularly tragic, because these were always men who, at the end of the day, had nothing to do with the crime.
Kroll saw no problem with that. Oh, that's their problem. That would be their difficulty. I can get away with it. And to get away with it for 21 years, so consistently, with so many deaths in such a small area, is horrifying, but also remarkable.
In total, 2 men were falsely accused or imprisoned, and 3 men committed suicide in relation to Kroll's murders. Another 5 victims of the callous killer. After his arrest in July 1976, it appeared to detectives that Kroll was almost relieved to be captured.
He wanted this sensation gone, which had always led him to commit these crimes. So he really felt the need, and he thought that when he told his story, that it would go away somehow.
In terms of what Kroll expressed about his punishment, it is quite childlike and quite immature in a way, because he thought that he would just go to hospital and his funny feelings would be cured and then he'd be able to go home. So this implies quite a kind of simplistic interpretation of his own problems.
But Joachim Kroll could not make these murders simply disappear. He would have to face justice for his crimes. Kroll may have gone on to kill many more women, but one costly mistake had led to his capture, and a gruesome discovery in his home had stunned the country.
He presented to the world as friendly, plausible, agreeable to his neighbours in Duisburg. The local children would visit him, although I think sometimes their parents must have been a little suspicious. He was known as Uncle Joachim.
We
also tried to speak to those around the neighbourhood, asked who knows him, who had contact with him. People said he was a bit weird, a bit odd somehow, but he was dear old Uncle Achim, and in reality he was a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Behind this facade of Uncle Joachim and, oh, I like to look after you girls and I'm boys and they come round to see me and I'll give them sweets, was this man who was very, very angry, who wanted to make society well aware that they were living by a thread and he could cut it at any moment that he chose.
Kroll usually did his killing miles away from his Duisburg home. But in July 1976, suffering with a bad leg, he finally struck within his own community when he kidnapped and murdered 4-year-old Marion Ketter. It was the mistake that led to his capture.
His crime scenes got closer and closer, and therefore it was the dumbest thing he could really do, was take a girl from the direct neighbourhood. But as I said, his feeling was greater, and if he had thought about it, he should have said, "This, what I am doing now, is nonsense. They will catch me."
Door-to-door questioning throughout the neighbourhood led the police directly to Kroll. Inside his home was an horrific crime scene. Detectives found a saucepan on the stove with body parts in it. Worse still were the contents of the refrigerator.
There was this girl, completely dismembered, upper arm, forearm, placed on corresponding shelves, so that he only had to take something out and add it to the pan. That was unfathomable for us.
When we look at cannibalism, we're essentially looking at those who consume the bodies of other humans. And this is something that we do see sometimes in cases of serial murder. And it is about power and it's about control again. It's about completely possessing your victim. So not only have you taken away their life, you're now mutilating their body and consuming it.
Kroll disposed of other parts of the body by flushing them down the lavatory.
But that blocked the toilet, and that of his neighbour below as well. The neighbour approached him and said, "Hey, something is blocked here."
One of the horrifying things of Kroll's crimes was that he took pleasure in taking out the intestines of his victims. And He'd told a neighbour who was asking him what the smell was. He said rather flippantly, "Oh, it's guts," which it literally was, intestines. And the neighbour complained. Kroll was nothing if not brazen.
Kroll claimed he had butchered a rabbit and would make sure the remains were removed from the pipe.
He did that too, and he took it to the waste bins in the courtyard, where he disposed of it. He was seen by this neighbour, who then told our colleagues who were walking around asking questions, "Who has seen this girl last?" This neighbour told them of his observations, and so they checked the waste bin and found that this was not from a rabbit, but that they were human innards.
Kroll had kidnapped and murdered the helpless 4-year-old just days before.
Fühlte sich zu diesem jungen Mädchen besonders hingezogen. Und stand dann immer oben am...
He felt particularly attracted to this young girl. He always stood up in the attic looking down into the playground, saw Marion playing, and got this funny feeling. I want to have this girl, and I will snatch her up at the next opportunity. And the 4-year-old girl did then come into his flat with him. And then he strangled her, and after that did all these awful things that one can scarcely bear to talk about.
Schlimme Dinge gemacht, über die man kaum sprechen mag.
Well, I was shocked, because I had a son who was not that much older. I had not been in the homicide division long, only for 2 years. That was something where you had to more than just swallow. I have seen many things, but this was something completely new to me, that a human being was able to do such a thing.
Kroll had evaded detection for so long and had no remorse whatsoever for the suffering he'd caused.
He was not capable of feeling any sort of empathy towards anybody, especially his victims. They were simply objects to him that he wanted to manipulate and kill. And then he was content.
Dann war's gut.
Achim Kroll never cared about what he did. He did not even ask what her name was. He did not care. His tingling feeling was gone. The body remained there. He got up, possibly cleaned himself up, and then the matter was done for him. There was not even a reaction like, "When I count them up, you've been able to prove so many, that is so bad." Such things we did not hear from him. In that regard, he was totally emotionless.
Although he had confessed to killing at least 14 people, the police officially charged Joachim Kroll with 8 murders. On the 4th of October 1979, Kroll's hearing began in Duisburg. As the details of Kroll's gruesome sexual deviance were revealed, the case caught the public's imagination in a way few others have.
The, in some cases, excessive media coverage obviously contributed to Kroll becoming a case of the century. But on the other hand, from a criminologist's perspective, one has to say that there hasn't been a comparable case in Germany, at least since the Second World War, where so many people have been killed over such a long period.
Over the next 2.5 years, the court was only in session 151 times. But in April 1982, Kroll was convicted of all 8 murder charges against him. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The 49-year-old was immediately sent to Rheinbach prison.
Also Kroll ist für mich weder verrückt noch böse, sondern ein...
In my view, Kroll wasn't mad or bad, but was a human being who had failed in social terms, sexually, and in his work life, and who on this basis committed the most terrible crimes. In my opinion, Joachim Kroll would not have become a serial killer if he had been valued as a human being.
Als Menschen gezählt.
Whilst most of his victims were young, there was somebody who was in their 60s. So there was an array of victims. There wasn't a particular type. And the fact that he got away with this for so long, I think we should really ask ourselves a lot of questions, you know, as a society. How does somebody like this go under the radar for that long?
On July the 1st, 1991, 9 years after being convicted, Joachim Kroll died of a heart attack in Rheinbach prison. He was 58 years old.
I think Kroll did some incredibly evil things, which really do kind of breach not just legal codes, but social and moral ones as well. And what's interesting for me is what made him into this person that did these evil things. He didn't really have very much in the way of monitoring of his behaviour or any breaks on his behaviour. So I think where you have a situation like that, you can have somebody who turns into someone capable of real evil.
The news of Kroll's demise was of scant consolation to Marlies Voivod.
Ich habe, nachdem ich das erfahren habe, in mir persönlich Hass gefühlt auf Joachim Kroll. Und
after I heard about it, I felt hatred for Kroll and would have liked to wish on him that everything he did to the children and to the adults would be done to him. And I'm sorry that he died so early. And this anger I have will probably never go away.
Und diese Wut wird wohl auch immer in mir bleiben.
Had he not kidnapped Marion Ketter close to home, in one of his very few mistakes in this killing spree of 20 years or more, then I'm absolutely sure he would continue to kill. If there is ever anyone who could be said to epitomise what the word evil means, I would say it was Joachim Kroll, a genuinely evil man who defiled the world he inhabited.
For 21 years, West Germany was haunted by an almost invisible killer. Joachim Kroll was so ordinary that he blended into the background. While other men were accused of his most vile crimes, he continued to murder for his own gratification, regardless of the consequences. His capture came as a shock to the whole country, who will remember Kroll as one of the world's most evil killers. On November the 17th, 2006, police in the German city of Cologne searched the vehicle of a 47-year-old truck driver suspected of murder. What they found inside his cab was a collection of gruesome memorabilia.
When they searched the lorry, they found evidence that this was not a one-off act. There were Polaroid photographs of other victims. There were trophies in the lorry.
The driver was a man named Volker Eckert. His arrest brought an end to a 32-year career of murder.
Eckert was somebody who became much more skilled at committing murder the longer that his killing went on. So he had access, he had opportunity, and he really honed his killing routine.
The police had no idea just how many victims this long-distance serial killer may have claimed.
There would always be the question, were there 6 dead women, or were there 13, or even 19, or even more?
Back then, he was just beginning his brutal career. I was incredibly lucky.
Volker Eckert had terrorized Europe for decades and become one of the world's most evil killers. It was a case that spanned 5 European countries. When 47-year-old truck driver Volker Eckert was apprehended on the 17th of November 2006, the police had no idea of the extent of his history of murder. Eckert had been on the run for 2 weeks after killing a Bulgarian prostitute in the north of Spain. When detectives searched the cab of his articulated lorry, they found photographs and hair clippings from 5 women whom he'd abducted and murdered across Europe. Eckert's defense lawyer was Alexander Schmidtgall.
He confessed immediately after he got arrested by the police. You have this quite often when you have serial killers or when you have people who have a burden carried with them for a long time. It was like a relief for him to speak with someone and to tell what he did. Yeah? So it was like a confession in a church for him.
Schmidgall couldn't believe the person he was talking to was the same cold-blooded killer he'd read about in the police files.
So you think there's a monster in front of you, but the actual communication with him, he was a very normal guy. He was like someone selling you life insurance. He was nothing special.
Prosecutors wanted to find out what was going on inside the head of Volker Eckert. He was sent off to be assessed by forensic psychologist Professor Norbert Nedopil.
We came from prison, guided by two policemen, into my offices. And then he sat with me for several hours alone, without policemen and without any handcuffs. And we had a long and serious conversation, sometimes sad, sometimes for him or frightening events, sometimes also very nice and personal, and even sometimes we laughed together.
Eckert, who lived in the small town of Horf in Germany, had murdered his final victim on November the 2nd, 2006. Local journalist Rainer Meyer remembers the story well.
Volker Eckert hat seine letzte Tat.
Volker Eckert's last victim was the prostitute Milena Petrova near Ostelrich in Catalonia, North Spain.
Nordspanien, Katalonien. Dort hat
He picked her up there and abused her in his lorry. He spent another day driving around.
Herumgefahren in der Fahrerkabine. Und am nächsten Morgen.
And the morning after, he dumped her at a nearby stone bridge.
Steinbruch in der Nähe entsorgt.
On the way back from the stone bridge, he was caught on CCTV.
Einer Überwachungskamera.
Somebody was erecting CCTV cameras, which hadn't been there before, and just to test them, it panned. One of the images it caught was Eckert's lorry. And when the body that he dumped nearby was found, almost the first place the police went was to look at this entirely accidentally caught CCTV imagery, which led them directly to Eckert.
Eckert's job took him all over the continent. A Europe-wide search was conducted, and on November the 17th, 2006, detectives found him and his truck at a car wash in Cologne.
When they searched the lorry, they found evidence that this was not a one-off act. There were Polaroid photographs of other victims. There were trophies in the lorry. It was perfectly obvious that this was Eckert's lair. Almost every serial killer in one form or another has what's come to be known as a lair. And in his case, it wasn't so much a flat or a cottage or a house, it was the cab of his lorry.
After his arrest, Eckert immediately confessed to a murderous career that had lasted for over 30 years. It was the beginning of a huge international story.
Es waren 5 Morde, 3 in Spanien.
There were 5 murders, 3 in Spain, 2 in France. And from then on, it was a really hot story. As a journalist, you don't have a serial killer very often. And at that point, I tried to get as much information as I could about this person.
Wie möglich über diesen Menschen herauszubekommen.
His story begins over 50 years ago. Volker Eckert was born in the small East German town of Plauen on July the 1st, 1959. From a very young age, he developed a fascination with women's hair.
When he was 9 years old, he started to be fond of the doll of his sister, a doll which had long hair, and he put them in front of him on his bed. He was feeling sexual arousal, plunging his hands into the hair of this doll.
We describe him as a trichophiliac. This is somebody who gains sexual pleasure from hair, essentially. And I think he would have been aware of the fact that this was something odd, this was something out of the ordinary. And I think that would have created a bit of a sense of shame within him. So he was aware that this was something that he had to keep hidden.
As Eckert entered adolescence, his parents' marriage began to break down.
Well, he had quite a turbulent time during his teenage years. His parents divorced and he reacted really badly to this.
The separation for him was influential because the father had to leave the house and he said, I swore to myself, that will never happen to me and I will not marry because I don't want to work all the time and then be thrown out of the house. And he took sides with his father after that. But he continued to live with his mother.
He went off the rails, and one incident involved taking his parents' car and going off on a bit of a joyride. And then he returned home and he was in a lot of trouble for that. And it wasn't too long after that incident that he actually went and physically attacked and killed one of his classmates.
In 1974, aged just 14, Eckert experienced taking a life for the very first time. But it wasn't until his arrest in November 2006, over 3 decades later, that anyone knew about it.
Volker Eckert confessed to killing a classmate and to disguising her murder as a suicide. And that crime was not solved for years, or for almost 32 years.
On May the 7th, 1974, Eckert had knocked on the door of his 14-year-old school friend and neighbour, Sylvia Unterdörfel. Realising her parents weren't home, he took the opportunity of living out the fantasy he'd dreamed of since playing with his sister's doll as a child.
And then he thought, well, I have to do it with a real girl. And he, of course, like many fetishists, they realize they won't do it voluntarily with me. So I have to force them.
She was somebody who had very long, very beautiful hair, and he developed a real fixation, a real obsession with her hair. And he went to where she lived, her home, and basically wormed his way in.
First, this girl only played a role in his fantasy as a victim. But the point came when this fantasy wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to do it. He wanted to stroke her and then kill her.
Und dann auch töten.
He started right away after she let him in, closed the door, and he started getting at her throat and started to strangle her. And when she was unconscious, he plunged his hands into her hair.
Even as a teenager, Eckert had the sophistication to try and disguise the murder.
He strangled her with a clothesline, but he was quite cunning because he thought he needs to cover this up. So what he did is attach the end of the clothesline to a door handle to make it look as if she'd killed herself.
It is physically possible to hang yourself from a doorknob. You don't have to have your full body weight on the neck. And it's something that is occasionally seen, although it's uncommon.
Ihre Mutter, als sie dann von der Arbeit kam, hat die... Just as her mother was getting home from work, she walked in to find her dead daughter. Of course, like with every unnatural death, the East German investigation authorities began their work and came to the conclusion that it was a suicide. Es war ein Selbstmord.
At the end, Eckert managed to set up the scene so cleverly that the police fell into his trap.
And for 32 years, right up until Volker Eckert's confession, her parents had lived with the belief that their daughter had taken her own life.
Die spanische Polizei war zu dem Zeitpunkt einfach extrem stolz.
At the time, the Spanish police were extremely proud to have uncovered this series of murders. They wanted publicity. They wanted to be congratulated for their success. They needed a pat on the back. And also wanted to show the public that it was all over. Nothing like this would happen again. We've caught this monster of the highway.
Eckert admitted to the killings of 21-year-old Nigerian Sandra Osivo in 2001 and Polish national Agnieszka Boss in 2006, both in France. Journalist François Barrère could barely believe the scale of the investigation.
We realised that we were dealing with someone who'd been travelling the roads of Europe for 10, 15 years, and that this person had possibly committed crimes, certainly in many European countries. A lot of journalists did the same as the police, namely questioning the existence of case files, of unsolved crimes that might match Volker Eckert's style of killing.
Over the years, Eckert had developed a very familiar MO.
They always started with strangling, and that the woman got unconscious, that he felt the power. He always spoke about to see the consciousness go away from the eyes, and this was his attraction, yeah, to have control and to have power over another person. And to have the fetish with the female hair, with long female hair.
He was a man who had come to have a taste for strangling the life out of women who were not able to protect themselves. He wasn't a particularly big man, he wasn't a huge, strong man, but he was wiry, he was capable, and many of these young women would not have expected to have been treated in this way.
Strangling someone, the main thing that happens is that the blood supply to the brain is cut off. And once that's cut off, then you will lose consciousness in the order of 10 seconds. It takes a lot longer to actually die, but you can render someone unconscious very quickly by strangling them.
Eckert was somebody who became much more skilled at committing murder the longer that his killing went on. So his first murder was quite opportunistic, and it was somebody that he knew. It was incredibly risky, and I think he was very lucky to get away with that. And I think he realised that his luck was on his side at that time. And in later years, he targeted sex workers, because I think there was an awareness there that these people often go off the radar for long periods of time. They're a vulnerable group of people who will get into your lorry willingly. So he had access, he had opportunity, and he really honed his killing routine.
Eckert knew that prostitutes were far less likely to be reported missing immediately, if at all.
Lorry driving was the perfect subterfuge for a man who wished to kill women on the edge of society. He wasn't picking famous people, he wasn't picking rich people, he was picking people who no one would miss.
I think he had a real understanding, a real knowledge of the sex worker community, of how transitory it is, of how temporary it sometimes can be. And he realised that this was easy pickings for him. It wouldn't require much effort to indulge his fantasies and get away with it.
After his arrest in November 2006, Eckert had confessed to 6 murders in total. He appeared to have a complete lack of empathy for his victims.
He's speaking about tremendous, horrible things and details of killing or actually sexually abusing other women, and there was no fear, there was no shivering, there was no turning away of the eyes, there was nothing like a reaction you would expect if a normal person is telling this. I was always asking how you felt when you killed the woman. What did you do the day after? Did you look in the newspaper? Did you think to the parents? Did you think to the family of the girls? His emotions were missing. He spoke about himself like a monster who's not able to control himself, and that he has some defects. He knew this.
Although he admitted taking the lives of 6 women, Eckert still tried to separate himself from the murders.
He spoke about himself in a third person, like he's building a distance between the Mr. Eckert, who is committing the crimes and who is really doing horrible things, and the person who is sitting here next to you and speaking with you. So I think this was the way for him to handle this, yeah, because to think that the person who was committing the crime is someone else, because otherwise you cannot live. Yeah? You cannot live with this knowing that you are this monster.
Detectives believe that Eckert had likely committed many more murders over the previous 32 years.
So the investigators are relatively sure that it was probably 13 cases in total, even though it's not possible to prove this 100%. And in a further 6 cases, there was at least the possibility that it was him, because he was driving in the area.
Eckert's movements as a long-distance lorry driver were easy to track, using fuel receipts, GPS records and details of where he'd spent the night.
Ermittler aus ganz Europa haben
Investigators from the whole of Europe dug out their old cases and compared them with the movements of Eckert that the police in Bayreuth had mapped out. And they tried to find crimes that had taken place when Volker Eckert was driving through this country.
Scotland Yard came over to Germany to question. Then there was the French police as well, because every police knew there's a serial killer. So look at the cases where was a woman sexually abused. Maybe this Mr. Eckert was nearby at the time she was killed.
Investigating officers could link Eckert to the murder of 3 more prostitutes between 2002 and 2004 based on his movements. 1 in France, 1 in Italy and 1 in the Czech Republic. Francois remembers visiting a crime scene that bore all the hallmarks of an Eckert murder.
This was a prostitute who worked near the entrance to a motorway in Montpellier, who disappeared one day and was found 300 kilometers away in a motorway rest area near Montélimar. That's in the area of going back up north, so in other words, potential routes Volker Eckert could have taken when, for example, he returned from Spain to get back to Germany. And this young woman I remember because I used to see her on my way to get a newspaper. She had a very thick head of brown hair, and we knew that Volker Eckert actually had a hair fetish. And this young woman was found dead, stripped naked, in a motorway rest area 300 kilometers from the place where she worked. This matched Volker Eckert's modus operandi exactly. He often moved the victims he had abducted somewhere and killed somewhere else, disposing of the bodies tens of kilometers away to cover his tracks.
Back then, he also committed several more crimes in Plauen. He waylaid women during the night, threw them to the ground and strangled them, but didn't kill them.
18-year-old Eckert was jailed for a year for sexual assault after he was caught strangling a woman in 1978. But it did not curtail him. Between 1979 and 1987, he assaulted dozens more women.
He had attacked several. He talked about 30 women in the dark, so they wouldn't recognize him without killing them. He strangled them. He gripped into their hair, and then he went home and masturbated. That was for several years, well, more than 2 at least, but he said 30, maybe more, attacks against women like that in his hometown.
There are no official records of how many women survived or died after Eckert's attacks. He was finally stopped in 1987 after he assaulted 2 women in Plauen and left them for dead. Both were able to identify him to police. One of those women, whose name we have changed to protect her identity, is Claudia, who was only 16 at the time.
Ich war auf dem Heimweg von einer Party. I was on the way home from a party together with my friend. Und auf dem Heimweg sind wir dann erst. I took her home first and wanted to walk the rest of the way by myself. Und als ich allein weiter bin nach. As I continued to walk alone, I noticed after around 100 meters that somebody was following me. When I walked faster, the person behind me also walked faster, and when I slowed down, also he was slowing down. At that point, I already felt a bit threatened, so I grabbed my bunch of keys, hoping to be able to defend myself. Maybe I could hit him in the face. Und bin weitergegangen. Und an einer Straßenkreuzung. He suddenly came up behind me at a crossroads and pushed me to the ground. Then he put his hands around my neck and choked me. I then tried to defend myself, but he was stronger, heavier, more powerful. I had no chance. I tried to play dead in the hope that he would let go, but that didn't work.
Aber auch das ist nicht gelungen. Kniete dann.
He knelt on top of my legs, so there was no chance for me to move anywhere. He was strangling me with his hands. I really struggle to describe it. This pain and the pressure. It was very brutal and incredibly violent. At that moment, I gave up my life. That was it. I knew it was over. I saw a tunnel with a white light at the end of it. It was really like that, a near-death experience.
Incredibly, Claudia survived the attack and was able to give a detailed description of her attacker to the police.
To this day, I still can't forget his face.
Eckert had applied to leave communist East Germany behind and move to the freedom of the West. But when a drawing of Claudia's description of his face was distributed amongst the police, an officer recognized him, and he was immediately arrested before he could flee the country.
The day of his court hearing arrived, when he was about to be convicted. He was sitting only a few meters away from me, and suddenly he apologized to me. For me, well, there can be no excuse for a crime like this.
In 1988, Eckert was sentenced to 12 years in prison for attempted murder. During his time behind bars, he underwent therapy for his sexual deviance, which the prison authorities saw as a success.
The doctor or the psychologist who saw him was very certain that Volker Eckert could control his sexual urges from then on. And this was apparently supposed to have been ensured, as he was supposed to undergo more therapy when he made it out of prison. But he didn't do it.
Unbelievably, Eckert served just 6 years of his sentence, and in 1994 he was released into the world yet again. And he headed straight for the woman who put him behind bars.
One night, he was standing in front of my door. He rang the bell wearing a boiler suit, one of these blue ones, and said, "There is a burst pipe, you must let me in." I had a little peephole in the door, a tiny little hole where I could look through, and there I recognized him. I did not open the door, but I know it was him. He tried to find me. I don't want to know what he wanted to do with me. Now it's over, thank God, but he definitely wanted to attack again.
Hat definitiv noch mal angreifen wollen.
By 1994, the Berlin Wall had fallen, and Eckert was free to travel wherever he wanted.
After he got out of prison, he was able to slip through the net of the authorities. He was able to give them as much as they wanted, but not too much, to see that there's a dangerous person who is still dangerous for the society, who is still running through life with this, let's call it disease, with these criminal obsessions.
Wir haben die Frauen leid getan.
I felt sorry for the women, because while he had been in prison, psychologists and other similar professionals would have actually realized that he was still a danger to society. But because of the reunification of Germany, he was released, and nobody seemed to care. Even though he was a tried murderer, he was let go without any sort of assessment, and the women could all still be alive if only someone had acted differently.
Anders reagiert hätte.
Eckert settled in the small town of Hof, just 20 miles from Plauen.
Hat dort in Hof dann Fuß gefasst.
So he had landed on his feet in Hof and settled in well, and was well liked. His landlady also said she had rarely encountered such a nice tenant, and everyone was completely flabbergasted when they found out just what sorts of crimes Volker Eckert had committed, despite everyone considering him to be a nice guy.
Alle für einen netten Kerl hielten.
By 1999, 40-year-old Eckert had taken a job as a long-distance lorry driver, a profession that suited the killer perfectly.
It allows them to go off the radar for quite extended periods of time. They work unsupervised, they don't answer to anybody, and they have these long stretches of time to ruminate and to basically get lost in their own thoughts. So that creates an environment in which their fantasies start to become a reality. And then when they do offend, we often find that they can dump the bodies of their victims in a completely different police jurisdiction to the one that they picked them up in. And that creates something called linkage blindness within the police who are investigating these crimes. They don't always connect them immediately.
When police finally caught up with him in 2006, Eckert's truck was like a shrine to his victims. Photos and hair clippings had been collected in his cab.
They were his trophies, if you like, along with hair and various other things. They represented for him the reason. The body itself was disposable, but that memory and that lock of hair or locks of hair were his explanation to himself about why he was doing it. That was what he was there for.
Hat auf diese Polaroid-Fotos.
He also made notes of the details of each crime on the back of these Polaroid pictures, so that he could later remind himself of what had happened in each attack.
Hat in kleinen Plastiktüten.
He kept the prostitutes' hair in little plastic bags, having cut it off after the crime. He kept items of clothing, but the owners of some items of clothing still haven't been determined today.
Manchen weiß man bis heute nicht, zu wem die gehören.
Ce qui a tout de suite attiré l'attention.
What caught our attention straight away was the fact that the killer was a fetishist. In other words, this was someone who kept souvenirs of their crimes, who took things from their victims, including locks of hair, things like that, keeping things, souvenirs, fetishes, keeping them in a kind of, like some kind of treasure. He is the kind of character you don't find too often in European crime stories, and in this case, we were almost imagining a film character.
On avait vraiment l'impression presque d'un personnage de cinéma, quoi.
He created a little repository, essentially, and this is something that's quite common for serial killers, and it serves several functions for them. So it enables them to relive their crimes, to revisit that moment when they were all powerful and fully in control. But it also acts as a bit of a stimulus to do it again. So it really is a vicious circle when it comes to trophies.
La plupart des criminels, ils se débarrassent.
Most criminals get rid of any evidence that could link them to their victim. This guy, he kept it all. And that alone is something you hardly ever see in criminal cases.
Prosecutors had sent Eckert to be assessed by forensic psychologist Professor Norbert Niederpil, and the killer seemed to open up during the sessions.
In the end, he said, well, for several months, I was very withdrawn in myself. Now I could even laugh and I was freer. He said, I'm glad to talk to you. The 3 or 4 days that we were together, he said, I slept better, I talked better, I was more relaxed than usual.
Professor Niederpil analysed Eckert's psychological condition for the upcoming court case.
The actual conclusion is that he is psychiatrically a sadist. A sadism developed from fetishism, and this, in the legal sense, is a mental disorder. And this mental disorder would lead to a diminished responsibility concerning the sexual acts, but not the killings that have been done to prevent detection. And that he would be a repeat offender, and if released, even after a prison sentence, would not stop it.
He was really preoccupied with what other people thought of him, and he was being portrayed in a way that he didn't think was fair. He's been committing these crimes for over 30 years, and I think he's developed quite a grandiose sense of self. And when he's reduced to the label of a monster, he's really not happy about that at all.
For local journalists in Horf, the trial of this perverse killer, due to take place in the local courthouse, was set to be a huge story.
Ja, jede Schlagzeile ist gut für eine Zeitung und jede spektakuläre.
Every headline is good for a newspaper, and every spectacular story is good for a newspaper. And it isn't the newspaper's fault that it interests people.
Alles, was nicht normal ist.
But everything that isn't normal stirs people. And if someone living in a community finds out that the nice uncle was not actually the nice uncle that everyone thought he was, but a perverse serial killer, then that stirs people too. And then they want to know as much as possible about it. And we are there for the purpose of delivering that information.
Menschen auch, und dann wollen die möglichst viel darüber wissen und diese Information zu liefern, dafür sind wir da.
While waiting for his trial in custody, Eckert had lost the support of his family.
I remember very well he was very desperate that he had completely lost the contact to his family because his sister was always a very important point of contact for him through his whole life, and she didn't want to have contact with him.
Dann saß also in Bayreuth in dieser Justizvollzugsanstalt.
He was sitting inside his cell in the prison of Bayreuth and had a lot of time to think.
An seinem 48. Geburtstag.
On his 48th birthday, the 1st of July 2007, he knew that he would be officially charged with murder within the next few days.
Dass als Mörder angeklagt werden wird.
Nobody came to see him that day. His sister didn't visit, and neither did his brother.
Andere Familie, sein Bruder nicht.
It all became too much for him. On the night of his 48th birthday, July the 1st, 2007, Volker Eckert was left alone in his cell. The following morning, his body was found hanging from the bars.
War ganz allein und in dieser
He was all alone, and during the night he brought justice to himself and hanged himself in the cell.
in der Zelle.
It would seem rather strange that here we have somebody who was obsessed with harming other people by strangulation, and he makes a decision to take his own life by the same means. And it is a way to end your life when you're in prison, and it's not difficult to get hold of items to achieve that outcome.
Eckert's death meant he would escape justice. It came as a surprise to the people who'd got to know him better than most.
I talked to him about suicide at several occasions, and he said several times, I'm a coward, I won't do it. But I know that I have no chances.
If you ask me how I feel about him, I cannot say I like him. But you're a human being and you are in contact with this man. I never see him killing someone, I only read this. But you have contact, you see him 2-3 times a week, and you see how he's reacting, and you feel how all the court, all the authority of the state is against him, how the press is calling him a monster, a murderer. In this way, he doesn't deserve this treatment also in the public, and he deserves for sure a fair trial, and to defend him as best as you can. And I felt sad when I heard that he killed himself, because you develop a relationship also with your clients in prison, especially when you take over the case for such a long time. You develop a relationship, and he ended this in a way that like he ended other lives, he ended his own life himself.
Claudia, who survived a brutal attack by Eckert in 1987, had been planning to attend his trial.
Als ich einen Telefonanruf bekam von einem Journalisten.
When I got a call from a journalist telling me that Volker Eckert had killed himself, my first thought was coward. A coward who is dodging responsibility for the gruesome acts he committed. After a considerable amount of time, I was then running out of accusations. I had come to terms with the situation and was even glad that he had killed himself, because this gruesome human could no longer hurt anyone.
On the one hand, I believe it was simply the best solution and the fairest solution. As if he wanted to say, I'm taking my own life, just like the lives I have already taken. But on the other hand, a lot of things that haven't yet been explained will never be clarified.
Hätte geklärt werden können, nie geklärt werden.
There were many questions still to be asked about Volker Eckert's crimes. His death means they will remain unanswered.
Lorsqu'on a appris la mort de Volker Eckert,
I had a feeling of frustration above all.
Parce que j'ai compris que on ne connaîtrait exactement.
I knew that Volker Eckert's death meant the end of any investigations that could have been reopened on the old case files that no one was interested in anymore,
Pu être réouverte sur ces vieux dossiers.
and which had only reappeared in police and media news.
C'est revenu dans l'actualité policière et médiatique. Ces mystères-là.
In the end, these mysteries would never be solved. And that is what's truly shocking about the death of Volker Eckert, that those victims will never be granted justice.
Ces victimes-là n'auront jamais justice.
In December 2007, 5 months after his death, police closed the file on Volker Eckert. The Europe-wide investigation was over.
Und hat sich an viele Taten sehr gut und
He could remember many of his crimes very well, and indeed very precisely.
Und das wäre natürlich für die Presse ein.
Surely that would have been a massively exciting trial for the press, and of course also for the readers, who would have wanted to keep up with the news. The trial would have taken months, with enormous coverage from international media, because the crimes had been committed across half of Europe.
Dadurch, dass die Taten in halb Europa verübt wurden.
Just how many helpless women were killed at the hands of Eckert may never be known.
I'm quite sure that there was no gap of time where he didn't do anything. So, because he always spoke about himself as someone who is not able to control the desire and his obsession. So, if you ask my personal opinion, I think there's a high percentage that he did more than he admitted to. Yes.
Das wird immer das Rätsel.
There will always be the question whether 6 dead women, or whether 13, or even 19, or even more. He has taken this mystery with him forever.
There have been estimates of 22 across Europe, France, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Spain. He was relentless and he was successful in evading the attentions of the police for a very considerable period of time.
The shadow of Volker Eckert remains not just over the women he murdered, but also the ones that got away.
There will always be a part of me that will probably never forget. I can't imagine it. I experienced it. I know what I had to go through.
Volker Eckert was a relentless, predatory serial killer, preying on vulnerable women. He took pleasure in it. He took a great deal of sexual satisfaction from it. He was a man who deserves the epithet evil.
Eckert was a callous murderer who showed no remorse for his actions. He took the life of a 14-year-old girl for his own gratification before embarking on a 32-year-long killing spree. It will never be revealed exactly how many young women he murdered. By cowardly taking his own life, Volker Eckert robbed many families of justice and proved himself to be one of the world's most evil killers. In the autumn of 1984 in Paris, France, 2 men embarked on a brutal crime spree. In just 6 weeks, they attacked 9 elderly women in their homes, intent on taking their money and their lives.
It was a spree, without any doubt, and a spree of the most murderous kind.
21-year-old Thierry Paulin and his partner Jean-Thierry Mathurin tortured their victims, even killing one of the women by making her drink drain cleaner.
I must admit that when I studied the case files, the photos and pictures were awful. It was difficult, very difficult.
But after the couple split, it was Paulin who went on to become even more prolific, eventually confessing to killing 21 women when he was arrested in December 1987.
He really was the worst criminal I have ever seen in the course of my long career. The worst.
Thierry Paulin had undeniably become one of the world's most evil killers. It was a series of senseless killings that left the whole of France stunned. When 24-year-old Thierry Paulin was apprehended on the 1st of December 1987, he admitted to the murder of at least 21 helpless elderly women. In a series of killing sprees across 3 years, Paulin, a thief, left behind no witnesses at his crime scenes as he brutally strangled his victims to death. Detectives Jean-Claude Moulet and Claude Perroni had the task of bringing Paulin to justice.
Nous étions littéralement sous pression. La seule peur.
We were under immense pressure. The only thing we were afraid of was being on call. In other words, would a phone call wake us up that night? Headquarters calling us about a case, telling us about the killing of an old lady. We dreaded finding more victims every time.
On avait cette hantise de retrouver à chaque fois d'autres victimes.
Paulin n'est pas un tueur en série. C'est un tueur en chaîne. Le tueur en série est un tueur pathologique.
Paulin was not a serial killer. He was a spree killer. A serial killer is a pathological killer who kills to experience a physical, immoral pleasure. In other words, he enjoys a terror he inspires in others. The spree killer is different. Paulin was a born criminal. In inverted commas, he was complete riffraff. Attacking a grandmother is a triumph without peril which brings no glory.
S'attaquer à une grand-mère, hein? À vaincre sans péril, on triomphe sans gloire.
In a twist of fate, Paulin himself would be dead before the trial of his accomplice, Jean-Thierry Mathurin, in December 1991. Philippe Bilger was prosecuting.
Paulin escaped the trial. Unfortunately, it was AIDS that killed him. And of course, we can lament the fact that the mastermind, the instigator, was never brought to justice. This much is clear. Forgive me for being crude, but the criminal justice system took what was left. In other words, Mathurin.
Mathurin was on trial for the murder of 8 women in just over 1 month during the autumn of 1984. The details of the slayings were shocking, even to Mathurin's defense lawyer, Michel Arnaud.
The photos and pictures were awful. It was difficult, very difficult. I must admit that when I studied the case files, I made sure that I didn't have lunch. I didn't have dinner. I couldn't.
The killings always followed the same horrific ritual.
Thierry Paulin les poussait dans l'appartement en leur tenant la bouche.
Thierry Paulin pushed them into the flat, holding their mouths. Jean-Thierry Mathurin closed the door. And from that moment on, Thierry Paulin hit them to get them to tell them where the money was. Jean-Thierry Mathurin went to look for electrical cables to tie them up, so Thierry Paulin could tie them up. He went to search the flat. If the victim revealed where the money was, Jean-Thierry Mathurin went to check if it was there. And in the meantime, Thierry Paulin became incensed and ended up strangling them.
S'acharnait et finissait par l'étrangler.
This killer's story begins over 50 years ago. Thierry Paulin was born in the former French colony of Martinique in the Caribbean on the 28th of November 1963. His teenage parents split up within days of his birth.
His father abandoned he and his mother pretty shortly after his birth and went to France. Thierry remained in Martinique and was effectively brought up by his paternal grandmother, who owned a restaurant and apparently neglected him. He made an attempt to go back to live with his mother, who by this point had remarried and had another family, but he didn't fit in incredibly well with that. In fact, he was a troubled young man.
This is a young lad who's being passed from pillar to post. He doesn't have a lot of stability, he doesn't have a lot of routine, and life is quite chaotic. He's somebody who finds that he never settles in anywhere, and he never really has a sense of belonging.
After moving to France, Paulin joined the army, but he was reportedly picked on for being of mixed race and a homosexual. In 1984, the 21-year-old moved to Paris.
When he left the army, he went to live with his mother, and he got a job at an entertainment venue that had a reputation for transvestite performers. And he joined in with this. I think this was the first time in his life when he really felt a sense of belonging. And Thierry was homosexual, and he developed a relationship with a man he met at this place.
Paulin's new lover was 19-year-old Jean-Thierry Mathurin. The like-minded couple had aspirations of performing on the stage, and they also shared a passion for dressing in drag.
I think if we look at his relationship, being homosexual in France at this time still carried quite a significant degree of social stigma. So even though he's found his place in the world, other people are still judging him, and I think that's something that is always going to trouble him.
The couple began living together in a hotel called the Laval. The flamboyant pair had become addicted to drugs and weren't living within their means.
It was the world of nightlife. They were invited to all the big Parisian parties. There were transvestites, people who loved to dress up, so they put on a real show.
Ils s'aimèrent profondément, il me semble. Mais
I think they really loved each other. I think there was real love there, but as part of that, Paulin dominated his partner, which explains a lot the influence Mathurin was under. He existed through Paulin.
l'influence que Mathurin a subie et qu'il a existé par Paulin lui-même.
Obviously, I didn't see them in their everyday lives. I didn't see them living together. I didn't see them laughing. I didn't see them in their most intimate moments. But I think it's clear that Paulin dominated Mathurin and gave him the drugs he needed. As so often in life, and that's also true for criminals, there was a strong one and a weak one in this couple. And the weak one was dragged into a life of crime by Paulin during these atrocities in 1984. That much is clear.
To pay for their lavish lifestyle, Paulin, with Mathurin in tow, turned to crime.
Each case, the motive was straightforward: money. Mathurin and Pauline wanted to have a good time. They wanted to go out, they wanted to party, they wanted to go to nightclubs, they wanted to indulge their appetite for drugs, they wanted to wear different clothes, they wanted to be acknowledged as homosexual, and they were intent on having as good a time as possible. It was a spree, without any doubt, and a spree of the most murderous kind.
We had two criminals under the influence of drugs who were completely remorseless and were looking for money, who laid waste to the scenes of their crimes, carrying out the worst kind of atrocities on these unfortunate old ladies.
The old women were coming back from either the post office or the market. They came back with food and bread, etc., and which was found scattered on the floor in the doorway.
It was child's play to push open the door and enter behind them, and then to subject them to mental and physical torture.
The attacks were shocking in their brutality. The killers ripped off their victims' clothes, burnt their feet, and even smashed a wine bottle over one lady's head. Another was suffocated with a mattress, and in the most extreme case, 84-year-old Alice Benaim was forced to drink cleaning fluid.
Something like drain cleaner, the main effect it has on the human body is that it is corrosive. So it will cause chemical burns to the mouth, tongue, the lips, and then if it's swallowed, it will cause chemical burns in the esophagus and the stomach, can potentially cause perforations. And if the fumes get into the lungs, they can set up a chemical reaction there, causing fluid on the lung and all sorts of potentially lethal consequences.
One victim was Alice Benaim. To tell them where her money was, Paulin and Mathurin forced her to drink a product used for unblocking sinks. You can only imagine the suffering to make her reveal where she had hidden her savings. One of them used to hide her savings inside her corset. She had pockets full of money. The way they made them talk was by twisting their fingers. It was to make them suffer.
Voilà, le moyen de les faire parler, c'était de leur tordre les doigts, c'était de les faire souffrir.
During this 2-month spree, the horrific murders sent shockwaves across the country, especially in the Montmartre district of Paris, where the majority of the crimes had taken place.
Je crois que ce qui a beaucoup frappé l'opinion publique, c'est
I believe that what really struck public opinion was that the killer was targeting old, vulnerable, defenseless people. I believe that's what had the biggest impact on the public. There was no comparison between one murder and the next. It was the fact that these were defenseless people who were being killed.
tuer des gens sans défense.
Les gens étaient abasourdis.
People were stunned, asking, why don't they arrest them?
The public wanted justice, but detectives were struggling to find any suspects.
And the longer it went on, the fewer facts we had, because everything had been tried to find them. All of the investigations had been done, from our perspective, but the luck factor was missing.
You have to see that with the atrocity and repetitiveness of their crimes, as well as the fact that there were no central police files at the time, that there was a general feeling that they wouldn't be arrested. And that created a real panic amongst the public.
Well, there was some speculation in the press that at the time that these offences were happening, that the neighbourhood of Montmartre had developed this mass hysteria, this mass psychosis. And psychologists find that this does tend to happen when you have an area where there's a phenomenon like a series of unsolved violent crimes. It makes people fearful, it makes them change their behaviour, it makes them often act in rather irrational ways, because their sense of stability and their sense of belonging in their community has been completely upset by what's gone on.
Even more pressure was put on the departments specifically responsible for questioning and arresting criminals. The sense of fear among the population persisted, compounded by the professional disarray in still having failed to question them and not having been able to do anything to ease the concerns of the public.
Pour faire diminuer l'inquiétude civique et populaire.
No one had seen the perpetrator or the perpetrators, a stranger in the block behaving abnormally or suspiciously. We had nothing.
Matching fingerprints were found at several of the murder scenes, but with no central database, these were no help to the police.
We had no database. That was created afterwards. It's always easy in hindsight to criticize the errors made by the police. But with the daily atrocities, they were in charge of finding a solution. It was very difficult. At the time, we didn't have the same resources as today.
It's a shame we weren't more efficient at the time. We didn't have a forensic database because Paulin was already known to the police.
Paulin had first come to the attention of French police after being convicted of a robbery in Toulouse in June 1983, when he was just 19 years old.
He holds up a grocery store, an old woman who's running a grocery store, with a knife. Not the brightest thing to do, given the fact that she knew who he was and that she lived to tell the tale. And he was indeed arrested and indeed sentenced to 2 years in jail for the attack. For some reason, and it's not entirely clear to me exactly what that was, perhaps it was to do with his age, perhaps to do with the old woman saying, oh, be lenient, his 2-year sentence was suspended.
Ses empreintes digitales ont été relevées.
His fingerprints had already been taken, but there was no central database and they remained in a paper file in Toulouse. So there they were, forgotten, as if they didn't even exist. Anyway, they never served for anything, because if we had been able to compare the prints to those in Toulouse after the first murder, we would have known that the prince belonged to Thierry Paulin, and the other murders would never have happened.
By November 1984, Paulin and his accomplice Jean-Thierry Mathurin had killed 8 women in Paris in just over a month. But then, almost as suddenly as they had begun, the killing stopped. No one could explain why.
Alors, on était conduit à se poser des questions. On a pu supposer que l'un ou les autres.
So we had to ask ourselves some questions. We could assume that the perpetrators had left the Paris area, or even that they might have been imprisoned, hospitalized, or may even have died. We did some research. Statements were sent to various prisons explaining the modus operandi. We sent the fingerprints we have found at the crime scenes to find out whether identical prints had been taken at the prisons. But the results turned out to be useless. We got nothing but negative feedback.
Il n'a pas été relevé d'empreintes digitales identiques à celles retrouvées. Mais ce résultat s'est avéré vain. On n'a eu que des réponses négatives.
In fact, Paulin and Mathurin had moved away from Paris and gone to live in Toulouse with Paulin's father. But while they were there, the couple's relationship became fractious.
That did not turn out to be a success. Pauline and his father argued. Pauline's father fell out with Mathurin, who he didn't care for. Pauline and Mathurin fell out, and indeed the relationship collapsed. Mathurin returned to Paris. Pauline decided to stay with his father for a time, but that didn't last either.
Paulin was alone in life, so was Mathurin, but Mathurin would never return to crime while Paulin continued.
In late 1985, 22-year-old Paulin moved back to Paris and the murders returned with him. Between December of that year and June 1986, another 8 elderly women were killed, and yet again, money was the motive.
I don't think we can say that he was a serial killer, because a serial killer is a sadistic individual who takes pleasure in killing, who kills for the sake of it, for the pleasure of killing. That wasn't Paulin. He kills for money. There was a police officer from the La Brigade Criminale who said, he killed like he was going to the bank. I don't think he even realized the horror of what he had done. He attacked old ladies, he killed them, but in fact he acted as if he was going to get money from the ATM. But he killed them so they couldn't tell anyone.
Paulin had developed a familiar MO.
À l'époque, j'étais entre guillemets spécialisé au niveau des autopsies criminelles et j'ai.
At the time, I was a specialist in criminal autopsies, and I was present at the autopsies of some of the grandmothers killed by Paulin. All the grannies were mainly strangled. None of the attacks were what you would call sexual. None of them. They mostly involved stopping the victim breathing, so killing them through mechanical asphyxia.
De la tuer par asphyxie mécanique.
Strangulation is primarily something that causes damage to the blood supply to the brain. Suffocation limits the air supply into the lungs, so eventually will cause problems through lack of oxygen. Strangulation is much more effective than suffocation.
Paulin was living in a hotel and loved to entertain the movers and shakers of Parisian society to boost his own social standing.
Il savait qu'il était limité.
He knew he was limited socially. He had aspirations to be something else, to be recognized, well-known and appreciated. He sought another kind of existence.
Il voulait exister autrement. Il a un côté extrêmement humain. Il a un côté humain, il a...
He had an extremely human side to him. There were people around him, especially ex-lovers, who knew him as a very sensitive person, who could be immensely kind, considerate, extra careful and attentive to others, to those he loved. So how could such an individual, and it is this that is so Machiavellian, how could this type of character transform himself into a killer who commits the act in half a second?
De se transformer en un tueur qui passe à l'acte en une demi-seconde.
Unbeknownst to the people around him, Paulin was like a real-life Jekyll and Hyde character. But this double life was about to be exposed. In August 1986, he was arrested on the outskirts of Paris when a drug deal went wrong.
Il n'est pas content de la qualité de la cocaïne qu'il a achetée.
He wasn't happy with the quality of the cocaine he had bought, which led to a fight with his dealer. He assaulted the dealer, who called the police. The police stepped in and Paulin was imprisoned, and so his fingerprints were taken again, but were not compared with those of the murderer of the old ladies.
Des vieilles dames.
They didn't know it, but the police had missed an incredible opportunity to solve one of the biggest cases in French criminal history. Even so, Paulin spent the next 16 months in prison.
While he's there, and remember this is the middle of the 1980s, he begins to demonstrate the symptoms of HIV. By the time he is released from prison, he's fully aware that he is HIV positive, which at that point then was effectively a death sentence.
Well, after he was diagnosed with AIDS, his offending really did escalate. And it wasn't just that he continued to kill people, but he engaged in almost kind of celebratory spree-like behaviour afterwards. So he would spend a lot of money. He would party for days on end. And I think that realisation that his life was limited, he was aiming to enjoy it as much as he possibly could. And if that meant the trauma and the suffering of other people, then so be it.
But finally, on the 25th of November 1987, the callous killer made a mistake.
During one of his final attacks, he was scared off by the concierge of the building. The woman he assaulted screamed, and the concierge came running in, after which a resident of the building saw Paulin escaping.
Va voir Paulin s'enfuir.
The survivor was 87-year-old Bertha Finalteri. She'd been strangled and left for dead. Detectives hoped she may be able to provide a description of her assailant. Meanwhile, Paulin continued unabashed, and just 2 days later, he murdered another woman, bringing the suspected total of victims to 21. He threw himself a lavish 24th birthday party just days later.
He invited around 30 friends with the money he had stolen from his last victim, and everyone said that Thierry Paulin was the perfect friend to party with, that he was a fantastic party mate. But no one knew where the money had come from.
As Paulin parted away, Bertha Finalteri had recovered and gave detectives a description of her unique-looking assailant.
He is a big guy. 1 meter 82, athletic, 75 kilos, mixed race, with an earring.
Un anneau à l'oreille?
A haircut like Carl Lewis, blonde hair. A photo fit was created by the forensic department, the very same sketch that would be displayed in police and gendarmerie departments everywhere.
Tous les services de police et de gendarmerie.
On December the 1st, 1987, 4 days after claiming his final victim, Thierry Paulin was apprehended on the streets of Paris. A police officer who'd seen the photo fit sketch recognised him and asked him to come to the central police station for an ID check.
I remember seeing him coming up the stairs under police escort. And of course, most of La Brigade Criminelle were waiting for him to arrive, to see who this guy was, what kind of person he was, etc. Everyone had worked hard on this case, so everybody was very interested in seeing him.
Detectives interviewing Paulin had a plan to get him to confess. They had a bottle of the same cleaning fluid he used to kill Alice Benaim in 1984 hidden away.
This story about the caustic soda is very important. When Thierry Paulin was arrested, he was taken to La Brigade Criminelle and put in front of a policeman who would be listening to what he had to say. And this policeman had placed a bottle of caustic soda under his desk. Paulin was opposite him talking about the murder of Alice Benaim. The officer said, "And Alice Benaim?" To which Paulin replied, "Yeah, I don't remember." "There were two of you." Paulin, "Really? I don't remember." "Really?" "Listen, it would be good if you do remember. There were two of you." Paulin was finding it difficult to come up with anything to confess. And then the policeman stuck his hand in the desk, pulled out the bottle of chemicals and said, "And this? What is this?" Paulin replied, "It's not mine, that's Mathurin." And just like that, he provided the name of his accomplice.
Although he admitted to killing 21 people, the police charged Paulin with 18 murders. He soon began to tell detectives everything they wanted to know.
Je le savais malade du sida. Donc, déjà conscient d'une chronique de mort annoncée.
I knew he was ill with AIDS, so already conscious of a chronicle of a death foretold. He knew that he was going to die. He had nothing left to lose, perhaps an urgent need to open up, to free himself. I would say even more to confess to the harm he had done, which meant that when he spoke to me, he told me everything. He got it all off his chest, demonstrating his extraordinary memory, his memory of the times, the locations and the details of the crimes he had committed. He relived everything he had done in front of me. That impressed me.
Devant moi, ce qu'il avait fait. Ça m'a impressionné.
Assez rapidement, il a donné des détails, pratiquement, de chacun des...
It didn't take long for him to provide details of virtually every murder he had committed. He even told them the colours of the curtains, for example. Details about the crime scenes that only he could have known, that no one else but the victims could have known. He was a cold, determined man. The kind you don't encounter very often as a police officer. Given the number of victims and the manner in which these people were killed, he didn't particularly show any remorse.
La manière dont ces personnes ont été tuées, il n'a pas manifesté de remords particulier.
C'est quasiment.
It's almost an act of religious repentance to say, I have killed, I did that. It liberates the conscience. He had nothing more to gain, nothing more to do with the world. He was already dead.
Il était mort déjà.
Forensic psychiatrist Serge Bornstein visited Paulin in custody to prepare a report for the impending trial.
Il nous a traités comme des importants, des gens qui venaient le gêner dans sa cellule.
He treated us like nuisances, people who had come to bother him in his cell. So he had to be very patient in trying to get a fair bit of information from him. Actually, he didn't show any signs of specific mental problems, but rather long-term psychopathic activity.
Sur le long temps.
Paulin's barbarism towards the old ladies he attacked is thought to stem from resentment towards his own grandmother, who had reportedly neglected him.
Peut-être qu'il se vengeait des défauts.
Maybe he was taking revenge for the faults of his family of origin. He probably bore the scars of his childhood, manifesting itself in his hostility towards old women. There was most likely some kind of symbolism at play, with him trying to get revenge, or to erase the cruel elements of his childhood.
Du symbolique, où il essaie de se venger ou d'effacer des éléments cruels de son enfance.
Here we've got an individual who was constantly rejected at several different levels. Rejected by his mother, didn't fit in with his wider family, rejected by his peers at school, and even society, given the inherent racism and the inherent homophobia. It just shows the impact that the combination of these rejections can have on an individual.
Jean-Thierry Mathurin had also been arrested and charged with the 8 murders he committed alongside Paulin in 1984. His defense lawyer, Michel Arnaud, has vivid memories of her one and only encounter with Paulin at a meeting organised at the Palais de Justice by the investigating judge.
Il voulait poser des questions à Thierry Paulin en présence de Jean-Thierry Mathurin.
He wanted to ask Thierry Paulin some questions in the presence of Jean-Thierry Mathurin in an attempt to find the truth. What was the true role of each man? What exactly had Jean-Thierry Mathurin done? Had he gone further than he had said? Because Jean-Thierry Mathurin said, I only did the searching. It was Thierry Paulin who tortured them, who killed them. And then I saw Thierry Paulin for the first time, and he actually came in laughing uproariously, a truly unforgettable laugh. It was completely surreal, inappropriate. And I have to admit that I was stunned. And actually, he didn't answer my questions. He just laughed. And Jean-Thierry Mathurin, I saw him, head down, staring at his shoes.
Regardant ses chaussures, voulant être ailleurs.
Paulin pointed the finger of suspicion directly at his ex-lover.
He blamed him for everything. It was Jean-Thierry Mathurin who had done it all. Him, he was in there for nothing. It was the complete opposite of what the case file said. Nothing came of it.
Rien n'en est ressorti.
There was definitely a time limit on Paulin in terms of the criminal justice process, because he committed so many murders, and bringing all of those victims justice would have taken an incredibly long time. You got an awful lot of evidence there, and that process can be many, many years in the making. And he was a man who didn't have many years. His health deteriorated very quickly after he was arrested, and he was dead within 2 years of being caught.
On April 17th, 1989, Thierry Paulin died in the hospital wing at Fresnes prison. He was 25 years old. Paulin's death meant that his accomplice, Jean-Thierry Mathurin, was left to face the weight of the French justice system alone. Philippe Bilger was prosecuting.
Il est évident que la société
It is clear that French society had been afraid for a long time in the face of the atrocious murders of the old ladies. And as soon as the trial came around, of course, public curiosity descended on the trial, for which only Mathurin remained.
You have to realize that at the time, we had just abolished the death penalty, and because of that, people were marching in the street, calling for the murderer of these old ladies to be executed.
Mathurin's trial began in December 1991. Paulin may have been dead, but his presence was felt in the courtroom.
Au procès, le fantôme de Paulin était là, partout. Et on m'a demandé de...
The ghost of Paulin was present throughout the trial, and they asked me to speak too, and I spoke about Mathurin, but I brought up all of the encounters I had had with Paulin. So I described this wicked character and his hatred for humanity, especially old ladies. And that really interested the court. He may no longer have been there, but his ghost hovered over the room. It was unbelievable. I think that even if he had been given the means to do so, Paulin would never have found redemption, because he had a hard core of criminal perversity within him.
De Paulin parce que c'était un noyau dur de perversité criminelle qu'il avait en lui.
Il est évident que, à l'encontre de Paulin, j'aurais demandé...
While obviously I would have requested the maximum mandatory prison sentence for Paulin, I wanted Mathurin to receive a slight reduction in his mandatory sentence to really indicate the difference between the two, and to do as if Paulin was also present, as if he was there too, in a certain way.
était là d'une certaine manière.
The main perpetrator of the murders was no longer able to be punished, so the court could only deal with the one offender who was still alive. But many felt that Mathurin was far from being just an accomplice.
This is crucial, because calling him an accomplice can make you believe that he didn't have a hand in the crimes like Paulin, the mastermind, did. He is the co-instigator, of course, but I have always thought that Mathurin probably wouldn't have committed the crimes he was found guilty of had it not been for Paulin.
Il n'aurait pas commis les crimes qui lui étaient reprochés.
Il y a une différence considérable entre le monstre Paulin et son collègue.
There is a considerable difference between the monster Paulin and Mathurin, his submissive colleague who only followed, manipulated by Paulin, who was far more intelligent than him, who was a very subtle man, but one who put all of that aside in favor of evil. He was two men in one, with one side well adapted to society and the other a monstrous delinquent.
Donc de délinquants monstrueux.
On the 20th of December 1991, 4 years after his arrest, Jean-Thierry Mathurin was given a life sentence for his part in the murders. He was released in January 2009, having spent a total of 21 years in prison.
Je suis profondément convaincue qu'il ne faut jamais désespérer.
I'm absolutely convinced you should never lose faith in humanity. So, that's my belief. I think even if you have committed terrible, atrocious acts, you can work towards turning over a new leaf with sincere remorse and the desire to redeem yourself. I think it's possible, and that our society has to work towards giving such people a chance.
Doit travailler pour donner leur chance à ces personnes-là.
Mathurin a réussi à gommer les...
Mathurin managed to erase quite a few memories and adapt to a normal social life. It was a very rare therapeutic success, because this is someone who has obviously committed crimes, participated in a series of crimes, who has recovered some kind of conscience, and from that time on is leading a completely decent life. We are faced here with a remarkable case of redemption.
On se trouve devant un cas exceptionnel de rédemption.
You know, if I had been in charge, I would have kept Mathurin in prison forever, without any qualms. This much is clear. You see, I wouldn't have cried if they told me Mathurin would live the rest of his life in prison. I am convinced that without Paulin, Mathurin wouldn't have done a thing.
Although he was never convicted because of his premature death, Paulin is still remembered in France as a terrifying and cold-blooded killer.
He really was the worst criminal I have ever seen in the course of my long career. The worst.
J'oserais vous dire que je pense qu'il avait une négation complète des valeurs humaines.
I dare say that I think he was in complete denial of all human values. He saw other people as just animals. He had an animalistic side to him, what we would call dehumanization. How can you kill a granny without thinking about what she stands for and all that kind of thing? He had a savage side to him, devoid of all forms of humanity.
Dénué de toute forme d'humanité.
I think he was a wicked young man. I think he was deeply troubled, but that is no excuse for the deaths of 19, 20, 21, 22 elderly women, nor for the brutal manner of many of their deaths.
C'était un être ignoble.
He was a vile being, a real monster, and it seemed like there was some kind of divine justice, because he perished in the worst circumstances, and it appeared as if the heavens, in their fury, had wanted to show that he had no place in humankind.
Il n'avait pas sa place dans le genre humain.
Paulin was a greedy hedonist whose lust for fun and popularity drove him to commit at least 18 horrific murders. His death means we will never know the exact amount. With and without Jean-Thierry Mathurin by his side, he callously targeted vulnerable elderly women and took their lives before he took their money. Thierry Paulin was, without doubt, one of the world's most evil killers. When 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy was found lifeless in her home in Hyde, Greater Manchester, England, on the 24th of June 1998, no one could have foreseen that her death would lead to the unearthing of one of the world's most prolific serial killers.
This is not a man who's hiding in the woodshed with an axe in his hand. This is a man who is pretending to be helpful and consoling and compassionate.
A popular local doctor, 52-year-old Harold Shipman, had been killing his elderly and vulnerable patients for over 25 years. But somehow he'd remained completely undetected.
That generation particularly trusted doctors, held them in great esteem and would have done anything they asked.
Shipman would eventually be found guilty of 15 murders, but an inquiry after his incarceration would estimate the true number of victims to be well over 200.
You know, he was a doctor, he had power over life and death, and somehow he seemed to get some kick from exploiting that. I mean, it's very hard to imagine.
Harold Shipman, the man nicknamed Dr. Death, had been unmasked as one of the world's most evil killers. When Dr. Harold Shipman was found guilty of killing 15 women in January 2000, the nation was in shock. But investigators had merely scratched the surface of his murderous career. The respected general practitioner, who was once a pillar of the community in Hyde, Greater Manchester, England, had been christened Dr. Death by the British tabloids. A 2002 inquiry into Shipman's crimes estimated that the number of deaths he was responsible for was at least 215. Detective Bernard Possells led the investigation into Britain's most prolific serial killer of all time.
I don't think that Shipman's victims knew that they were going to die. As far as they were concerned, quite often, Dr. Shipman was treating them. So people would willingly roll up the sleeve and offer their arm to him, and would probably be in the process of chatting to him whilst he was actually either administering the injection or taking a blood sample. But in actual fact, what he was doing was he was administering morphine in sufficient quantities to kill them.
Journalist Michaela Sitford was working for the Manchester Evening News when she first heard about the investigation into the family GP. She went to visit him at his surgery.
When I first met Shipman, I remember thinking how reedy and weak his voice was and how small he was physically. He wasn't imposing at all. And I knew from talking to people later on that he could be quite arrogant and high-handed. He knew the effect he was having on people. He was actually enjoying it at times. And I just thought that was evil and cruel, and he just broke the heart of a whole community.
As the inquiry went further, as we started to investigate more deaths, it was becoming beyond what I could ever have believed it was going to become, which is the largest serial killer that this country has ever known.
Shipman's story begins on January the 14th, 1946, in Nottingham, England. The middle child of 3 grew up on a council estate in a working-class neighbourhood.
Harold Shipman was one of the post-war baby boom generation, and this was a real age of opportunity where working-class kids could become middle-class professionals. So when he passed the 11+ exam and went to grammar school, his mother was very proud of him and she pushed him incredibly hard. And I think there was the expectation that Harold was the family's gateway to a middle-class life. And I think that pressure that was always there for him really bore down on him quite heavily because he wasn't naturally clever. He had to work incredibly hard to get where he got.
Shipman was particularly close to his mother, Vera.
When we look back at the childhoods of serial killers, we look at their relationships with their parents, and very often we see an awful lot of abuse, an awful lot of neglect. But in this case, it seems to be completely the opposite. Harold Shipman seems to have been targeted by his mother for excessive praise and really becoming very enmeshed and invested in him.
He identified with being her blue-eyed boy, and I'm sure that Vera said to him persistently, "You're the one that's going to make the Shipman name famous," which in fact he did, but for perhaps not the right reasons.
But when he was in his teens, she developed lung cancer. And she would sit in the window waiting for him to return from school, and he'd come in and make her a cup of tea. And, you know, they'd have a sit and a chat about their day, and she just looked forward to that moment.
In June 1963, 43-year-old Vera Shipman succumbed to cancer. Her doting son was devastated.
Harold Shipman's mother died when he was 17, and this was an incredibly traumatic event for him because his mother had played a very significant role in his life. She was quite controlling, she was quite domineering, she would always tell him what he should be doing, and suddenly she's not there.
But significantly, Shipman saw how the local GP administered diamorphine to his mother to help her pain. It's also possible that, and this is rather a gruesome way of putting it, that Shipman became fascinated with watching his mother die.
So you've got this all-powerful GP who's come into the family home and taken control of the situation. And I think that perhaps did plant a bit of a seed for Harold Shipman there. The fact that there's this individual who comes in, they have status, they have power, they have authority, and nobody questions them. And I think that's something that really did lodge in his mind.
By the mid-60s, Shipman had left Nottingham and headed to Leeds to study medicine. While living in Yorkshire, the young student met his future wife.
Primrose was Shipman's landlady's daughter, and he got her pregnant, and so they had to get married, and Shipman's carefree student days were over.
In 1970, Harold Shipman graduated from Leeds Medical School and got a job at the Pontefract General Infirmary in West Yorkshire. He was relatively recently married, had one child, and the other one was on the way. But what no one knew at that point was that Shipman had a completely different agenda from the Hippocratic Oath. He wanted to do harm.
After learning his trade in Pontefract, 28-year-old Shipman moved out of a hospital environment to take a role as a general practitioner.
Shipman joined the Todmorden Group practice, his first job as a GP in 1974, and he was like a breath of fresh air. He was young, enthusiastic, modern. They had all these great ideas and they thought the world of him.
But there were concerns raised by a pharmacy nearby about the amount of pethidine that was being prescribed by him.
When an investigation was launched and Shipman was confronted, he claimed to be suffering from depression and said he'd become reliant on injecting himself with pethidine, an addictive opiate-based painkiller.
It is not at all uncommon for healthcare providers, physicians, nurses, and others that might have access to drugs to become addicted because it's right there. Shipman was basically writing and forging prescriptions for himself.
But what he would do would be make prescriptions out in the name of some of his patients when in actual fact they didn't need it, and he would go and take the prescription to the pharmacy himself and draw it and use it himself.
When Shipman's addiction was discovered, he resigned from the medical centre where he worked. He was fined £600 by the General Medical Council, but he wasn't struck off. All he had to do was go and partake in some drug rehabilitation, and that was it. And there was never really any follow-up to that, so it was almost swept under the carpet.
I think the view was that he had a personal problem and that he wasn't actually a danger to anyone, which was clearly wrong.
By 1977, 31-year-old Shipman was back practicing medicine across the Pennines in Hyde, Greater Manchester. He spent the next 15 years as a GP at Donnybrook House Surgery, where he built up a reputation as a trusted family physician.
He had a very good bedside manner, a good ability to make people feel good about themselves. And as a result, he had a lot of patients.
They thought so much of him that when he moved from the Donnybrook Group practice in Hyde to start his own single-handed practice, he poached 3,000 of them, and there was a waiting list.
Shipman began his new venture at 21 Market Street, just across the road from Donnybrook House, in August 1992.
He was literally a pillar of the local community. Everybody knew who Harold Shipman was.
Because he would go the extra mile with his patients, he would spend time with them, he would sit with them and have a cup of tea, he didn't mind doing home visits. So he gave off the impression that he was a GP who genuinely cared, and I think that's what makes it all the more chilling when we look at what he went on to do.
For the next 6 years, Shipman would continue to win praise from his patients as a well-respected and well-liked doctor. Despite being a killer disguised as a saviour, he forged an unblemished reputation as one of the most trusted GPs in Hyde, Greater Manchester, England. However, by March 1998, suspicions had been raised about the 52-year-old by another nearby doctor's surgery.
There was a new GP, Linda Reynolds, who joined the group practice across the road from Shipman's, and she'd noticed that they were signing many more death certificates for Shipman than any other GP. And when she researched it further, she found that his death rate was 3 times that of any other doctor in town.
As a result of that, the matter was reported to the coroner reported it to the police, and an investigation took place.
This first opportunity to stop Harold Shipman failed due to a lack of incriminating facts to support the allegations.
The police investigation only lasted for 4 weeks, and it found that there was no evidence of wrongdoing on Dr. Shipman's part, so that was that.
It was to prove a tragedy, because had they investigated Shipman more carefully, they would at least have found more evidence that things were not exactly as they seemed. And perhaps, the abandonment of that investigation was the catalyst that saw Shipman take that one step too far.
Shipman had escaped unpunished for now, but it was only a temporary reprieve. His real downfall began with the death of the former mayoress of Hyde, Kathleen Grundy. Just like Shipman, the sprightly 81-year-old was well known and popular in the small town.
Kathleen Grundy was found dead on the 24th of June 1998. My 2 friends who called after she didn't turn up to the lunch club, she ran with them. The door was shut but not locked, and they walked in and found her lay on the settee, fully dressed.
On the day of her death, Harold Shipman had visited Kathleen to carry out a blood test. The news of her passing came as a total shock to Kathleen's family, including her daughter Angela and son-in-law Phil Woodruff.
She distorted my expectation of how an 81-year-old should be because she was just incredibly fit. She was remarkably energetic.
Kathleen had spoken to her son-in-law about Dr. Shipman during visits to Angela and Phil's home in Warwickshire.
She thought he was a very good doctor. She, I think, consciously moved herself onto his list and encouraged various people, other people, to do so.
After Kathleen's death, Phil finally got to meet this celebrated doctor, but was far from impressed with Shipman.
I mean, when we went to see Shipman immediately after she died, he inferred that she'd been very frail and infirm and not well, and that she died from old age, and we knew that was complete nonsense. He was not very sympathetic. He was rather, I don't know exactly how to describe it, but, you know, on the basis of Kathleen's report of him as such a nice chap, he seemed sort of rather cold and rather detached, should I say. So it was a bit strange.
Despite the family's concerns, Shipman had already filed Kathleen's death certificate.
It was clear that Shipman was trying to avoid an autopsy. I was naive enough to think that that was for our benefit, not for his. So rather stupidly, we went along with that. And then, of course, up turns this so-called will, which was just ridiculous. I mean, not only the content, but the way it was done. It was badly typed on a typewriter, on a pro forma, you know, the sort of thing you buy from the stationers. And it just was not Kathleen's style at all. She had a much more kind of professional approach. If she'd really wanted to produce a will that we didn't know about, and that would be very hard to imagine, she would have probably handwritten it because she had beautiful handwriting.
Not only did the scruffy-looking document appear hurried, it also omitted Angela and Phil. The will instead instructed that all of Kathleen Grundy's assets should be left to Harold Shipman.
Angela, I mean, obviously she was distraught. I mean, she was going to say, well, look, he can have it, you know. And I said, that's ridiculous, that's not your mother's will.
In the will, Kathleen said that she wanted to leave all of her money and her belongings to her GP to reward him for all of the care that he's given to me and the people of Hyde. Now, that really didn't ring true with Kathleen's family. And also in the will, it had said, my family don't need this money. They don't have a kind of urgency for it. So it really was highly suspicious.
We initially looked at the signature and compared it with the signature on, I think we had a driving licence of hers. It was similar, but clearly not the same. The alignment of the capital G was wrong.
Phil and Angela decided to play detectives. They were certain something was amiss with the will. Their initial port of call was to the witnesses who'd countersigned the document, both of whom were patients of Dr. Harold Shipman.
We showed her the signature and so on, and she said, well, it looks like my signature, but that's not the way I write my address. And she said she didn't know what the document was. She'd just signed the document.
It was a similar story with a second apparent witness.
I showed him not the whole document, but just the bit with the signature on, and his wife or partner sort of looked over his shoulder and she said, well, that's not the way you sign your name. Because there was a big flourish underneath the signature, and as I understood it, that was not what he would normally have done. So we realised that there was something seriously wrong.
Despite second-guessing themselves, Phil and his wife Angela, a solicitor, had begun to believe not only that Shipman had forged Kathleen's will, but that he may well have murdered her.
At that point, we realised that we needed to involve the police. But we didn't really think it was terribly realistic to sort of wander into Hyde Police Station and say, oh, by the way, we think that Dr. Shipman has killed my mother-in-law. So Angela talked to one of her partners who did criminal work, and he, of course, had contacts in the police in Warwickshire.
After putting their concerns in writing and handing it over to the local authorities, the complaint soon found its way to Greater Manchester Police.
Having received the report of concern, Greater Manchester Police launched an inquiry. What they quickly established was that the signatures on the will and on the letter were forgeries. Forensic scientists were able to tell just by the way that the signature didn't flow that it was a forgery in itself. They were also able to say the same about the signature on the letter that accompanied the will, that purported to have been made by somebody called J. Smith. Again, because the signature didn't flow, it was possible to say that that was a forgery.
The will and accompanying letter was sent off for forensic testing, and the results linked Shipman to the documents.
What we did find was that the letter and the will had been typed on a typewriter, a portable typewriter, and when we began the inquiry and executed a warrant at Dr. Shipman's surgery, we seized a typewriter from there. It turned out that the typewriter from Dr. Shipman's surgery had been the one that had been used to type the letter and the will.
When they asked Shipman about the typewriter and the will, he said that Kathleen Grundy had borrowed the typewriter off him, and yet there were no fingerprints on there from her.
And this was somewhat incredulous, wasn't it, really? The thought that the GP is lending the typewriter to a patient. He really is clutching at straws at this point in time, but he's so arrogant that he thinks people will believe him.
Shipman was still free to practice medicine as the investigation continued around him. The police knew they needed some hard evidence to prove Kathleen Grundy's death was suspicious, which led to a difficult decision being made.
No post-mortem had taken place before she'd been buried because Dr. Shipman had issued a death certificate, which would therefore preclude the need for it. But the concerns about the beneficiary of the will being Dr. Shipman, the timing of the will being coming to light, all led me to suspect that something wasn't right here. And so on the 29th of July, I went to see the local coroner, John Pollard, and made application for a warrant to exhume the body of Kathleen Grundy.
Detectives broke the news to Angela and Phil.
They both sat on the sofa over behind me and side by side and told us what was what, which was basically that they'd been talking to the coroner and got this permission to exhume Kathleen's body.
And in Shipman's mind, after he gave him the drugs and after the person died and after the person was buried, he thought he's home free. Who's going to exhume the body? It almost never happens. But they did in this case, and that's how they got him.
On the 1st of August 1998, Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed. The post-mortem findings by pathologists stunned investigators.
At first, they said that they believed that there were opiates in the body, but with some more sophisticated testing, they were able to say that it had been morphine that had been found in Kathleen Grundy's body. That in itself was a surprise to us. Kathleen Grundy had not been suffering from any condition which necessitated her being prescribed diamorphine, and she had been fit and well up until the days before her death.
The post-mortem results were staggering, but they were only possible due to Kathleen's family going against their late mother's apparent wishes.
The fake will had a box ticked where Kathleen Grundy had seemingly stated she wanted to be cremated, and obviously this would have removed any physical evidence that Shipman had killed her. But Angela wanted Kathleen to be buried near her brother and her parents, and it's because of this that she was buried rather than cremated.
If Kathleen Grundy had been cremated, then of course there would have been no remains to be exhumed, there would have been no opportunity to examine tissue, and we would not have discovered that she had died from a massive dose of diamorphine.
The net was closing in on Shipman, but he remained a free man. Detectives at Greater Manchester Police were trying to keep the investigation under wraps, but the press were about to discover what was happening.
I first heard about Harold Shipman in August 1998. Our news desk at the Manchester Evening News had got a call overnight that Kathleen Grundy had died and her doctor was being investigated for her murder. So I rang the police to see if we could get some background on this.
There is no doubt that the reporter who raised those queries, Michaela Sitford, had most of the story. And she then embarked on publishing that story. As a result of the public becoming aware, then they raised concerns by ringing the police about the circumstances of the death of their loved ones as well. In some cases, they'd harboured these concerns for years, but had been reluctant to raise them with the police because they didn't want to challenge what their GP said. But once this came to light, we started to investigate those deaths as well.
They came back to me with a statement saying they were investigating 20 deaths. And if those 20 deaths were all true, that made Shipman Britain's biggest serial killer.
Time was running out for the popular doctor. With evidence mounting up against him, the police finally decided to take action. 5 weeks after the exhumation of Kathleen Grundy on the 7th of September 1998, Shipman was ordered to speak with detectives.
Shipman was arrested by appointment, which sounds like a strange thing to do. Harold Shipman was aware of our inquiry. There was no surprise element here. There was no early morning raid like you see on films and the television. And so consequently, he came to the police station with his solicitor to answer questions. There's no doubt that he was confident that he was going to walk out of that police station after a few hours.
On the day Shipman was arrested, my colleague Chris Gleave and I waited outside Ashton Police Station where he was due to turn up to be interviewed. And as we're walking along, Shipman turned back and faced us, and he held his arms out, almost, you know, like Christ on the cross, and said, "Go on then, take my picture." And Chris did. And that was the last time Shipman was seen outside of custody.
Detectives questioned Shipman about the death of 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy.
Part of the interview involved Dr. Shipman telling outright lies. He sought to bamboozle the interviewing officers with medical terms. He tried to put across that he was intellectually superior to the officers. But as far as I was concerned, this was a fairly simple issue. Who'd been the last person that had been in the presence of Kathleen Grundy? What condition was she in when he left her? What was the cause of death? And who was most likely to have administered that cause of death? And with every one of those questions, you boil down to the answer being Dr. Shipman.
The interviewing officers presented Shipman with evidence of the will tampering.
Dr. Shipman denied that he'd ever seen the will. He'd ever been in its presence. But what we did find was that his fingerprint was on the back of the will, which made it difficult for him to continue with that claim.
Detectives knew that Shipman had visited Kathleen on the day of her death to carry out a blood test, but there appeared to be no proof of it ever taking place.
Kathleen Grundy's blood sample that he said to take didn't exist. It had never been received at the pathology lab. It still wasn't lying in his surgery weeks and weeks later. Where was it? And he couldn't explain those types of things. We concluded at the end of the interview that there was sufficient evidence to charge him with Kathleen Grundy's murder, and that's what we did.
The police knew they had a strong case against Shipman, but they were certain that if he'd killed Kathleen Grundy, it was possible he'd killed others.
In order to build the case against Shipman, the police needed to get a different type of evidence, and that would involve exhuming some of the bodies of Harold Shipman's recent victims to see whether there were substances in those bodies that really shouldn't be there.
The exhumations began on the 21st of September 1998.
We then exhumed the three bodies of Bianca Pomfret, Winifred Mellor and Joan Melia over 3 days. We got Dr. Rutherford to conduct post-mortem examinations on each of them, and we sent samples off for examination. On each of those people, Dr. Shipman had issued a death certificate, and each of those death certificates suggested that they had died from heart attacks. But there was no evidence of that when Dr. Rutherford carried out the examination.
Between October and December 1998, another 5 bodies were exhumed, making 9 in total. Kathleen Grundy may have been killed for financial gain, but it was becoming apparent that Harold Shipman had used his position of power to murder the people who trusted him the most just because he could.
Quite often, Dr. Shipman would turn up out of the blue. People had not sent for him. And within a very short time, after they'd been in his presence, they were found dead. And they were found dead in odd places. They were sat up in chairs, fully dressed, not in a scene of disarray, as if they'd fallen over, as if they'd knocked anything over.
Most of Shipman's victims were found sitting in the chair, a cup of tea by the side, almost recreating the scene that used to greet Shipman when he came home from school, with his mother waiting in the window while he made her a cup of tea and looking for him and waiting for him to come home from school.
Shipman is not a doctor. Doctors are people that try to heal others, that try to cure others. Shipman's a murderer. His goal for the greater part of his career was to kill patients, and he did it for his own gratification.
And that's what makes it so chilling. This was a man who was destroying people's lives for his own amusement, as if he were catching butterflies or crushing insects.
One of the exhumed victims, 73-year-old Winifred Meller, had supposedly died of heart-related problems. But pathologists found no proof of that in the post-mortem.
As inquiries developed, it proved that an examination of the computer showed that Dr. Shipman, in actual fact, had created a false record to indicate that she had been suffering from angina over a period of time in order for him to cover up the fact that he had administered an injection to her, which had resulted in her death.
I don't think Shipman's victims would have suffered. I'm not sure they would have understood that they were dying. The drug he used and the strength he used it at would just send them very quickly to sleep. And, you know, that's what you would hope. But I think the last words might have been, "Thank you, doctor."
Doctoring medical records became a common theme in the investigation into Shipman.
So, for example, Maureen Ward, who he killed when she was just 57, he changed her medical records to make her look like she had cancer when she'd actually been given the all clear by hospital doctors.
And although on first appearance it would appear that he'd made these weeks before, a computer expert that we utilised, when he had a look at them, he was able to examine the transaction logging within the computer system, and he was able to determine that they'd actually been made after he'd been along and murdered these people.
By the 5th of October 1998, Shipman had been in custody for almost a month. As detectives continued to interview the doctor, cracks in his cold demeanour began to show.
At the end of the second interview, when the computer records showed what Shipman was really up to in no uncertain detail, Shipman asked for a break in the interview, and as soon as the police left, he fell to his knees sobbing. He knew it was over.
There's no doubt that he had come to realise that virtually the game was up, that he had got no answers to these questions, where we were presenting him with documents and he just couldn't explain things away.
By February 1999, 53-year-old Harold Shipman had been charged with the murder of 15 women, ranging in age from 49 to 81. Post-mortems from 9 exhumed bodies confirmed they were poisoned, while circumstantial evidence linked the doctor to 6 other victims, all of whom were cremated. Despite all the evidence that suggested Shipman was a callous killer, it was difficult to comprehend, even for a seasoned detective.
There's no doubt that on a day-to-day basis, myself and my deputy questioned ourselves about whether we were interpreting this evidence in the correct way. Did we have this wrong? Was there another explanation for this? But the more evidence we uncovered, the more it corroborated previous evidence, and there was only one answer that we could come to, and that was the fact that Dr. Shipman had killed these people.
The trial of Dr. Harold Shipman began on the 5th of October 1999 at Preston Crown Court. The entire nation wanted justice served upon the man the papers were calling Dr. Death. The 53-year-old general practitioner pleaded not guilty to 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forging the will of Kathleen Grundy. The earliest killing, that of 81-year-old Maria West, dated back to March 1995.
It's important that all cases that go to court have a realistic chance of a conviction. So the threshold for evidence, even for a charge to be brought, is quite high. And we have to remember that in this case, some of these murders were years and years old. The quality of the evidence would have declined to such a degree that it would be very, very difficult to secure a conviction for murder. So there were only 15 counts of murder in this particular trial, but that was just the tip of the iceberg.
Of the 15 counts of murder, 9 of the bodies had been exhumed, but prosecutors were confident they could still get a guilty verdict on the others.
6 of Shipman's victims were cremated, but the police were still able to prove that Shipman killed them. This again is down to the computerised medical records being changed, added to which there were witness statements. And one of the most moving things about the court case was that there were so many ordinary people who'd never seen the inside of a court room in their lives, and they were having to stand there and give their evidence and remember their last moments with their loved ones. And it was because of their strength and their ability to give that evidence and remember what they needed to remember that Shipman was caught and stopped.
Phil Woodruff, the son-in-law of Shipman's final victim, Kathleen Grundy, was often in the courtroom during the 3-month trial.
He did come over as very arrogant, yes. He was very full of himself. And I think that was obviously part of his image that he created in Hyde, that he was a wonderful doctor, and I think he took great pleasure in presenting himself in this way. So yeah, he had a high opinion of himself.
It was an attitude that would be his undoing. When Shipman came under intense questioning from head prosecutor Sir Richard Henriquez, he buckled.
He was a worm wriggling on the end of a hook, because with each question that was put to him, he was really uncomfortable at trying to find answers to some of the questions. And some of the answers that he gave were pretty ridiculous. And he appeared to be thinking of some of the answers whilst he was stood in the witness box. It was another example of his arrogance. He appeared to decide that he was going to go toe-to-toe with one of the leading barristers in the country, and it wasn't a good idea.
On the 31st of January 2000, Harold Shipman was found guilty of all 15 murders and of forging the will of Kathleen Grundy. He was sentenced to life in prison, much to the relief of his victims' family members.
As each verdict of guilty was read out, there'd be like a fresh wave of soft sobbing or gasps, and it kind of built up. It was really filling the air of the courthouse. It was one of the most moving things I've ever seen.
Harold Shipman was convicted of all 15 murders and was sentenced to life in prison. And you would say, to a degree, justice has been done here, but actually for all of the other victims whose murders were not having charges associated with them, this is something that is kind of incomplete. I think that the families of these victims don't feel that they got justice.
In September 2000, an investigation was ordered to delve deeper into the career of Harold Shipman. High Court Judge Dame Janet Smith led the inquiry.
I think the Shipman inquiry was a brilliant legacy for the families of Shipman's victims. They worked really hard. They fought for a public inquiry because for years a doctor had been able to carry on unnoticed, killing people because of the secrecy and the reverence around the medical profession.
It was important to them that somebody carried out that examination and came to some sort of verdict about what had happened. And that's exactly what the public inquiry did. And I think that in itself gave some families the reassurance that they'd done what they could to find out what the true circumstances were.
The results of the initial inquiry were released in July 2002, and the findings stunned the world.
The Shipman inquiry have found that he is definitely responsible for 215 murders, but there could be as many as 260. Having said that, not every death will have been picked up, and I think there are many more than 260.
With so many victims in such a small area, it was perhaps inevitable that the inquiry would reveal some families had lost several relatives at the hands of Shipman. Phil Woodruff lost 3 members of his extended family. One of them had only signed on to Shipman's patient list after a glowing recommendation from Kathleen Grundy.
I don't exactly know how many people she recommended him to, but she certainly recommended him to her sister-in-law, Elsie Platt. I remember when Angela said to me about her mother, well, you know, old people don't die just like that. And I said, well, they do. Look at Auntie Elsie, right? So my example was actually of somebody else killed by Shipman.
The inquiry discovered it was not just women, but men who were victims of Shipman too. As a result of the report, Shipman was given a whole life tariff, which meant he would never be released from prison. Although given a chance to confess to his numerous murders, Shipman rejected the opportunity to speak with detectives.
So they went to interview him. They decided to video that interview. And what that video depicts is Dr. Shipman standing up, turning his chair away from them and just turning his back to them, so that although they ask him the questions, he refuses to answer, and he also refuses to look at them. And he never actually disclosed what had occurred in relation to many of those offences before his death.
In a heartless move, Shipman decided to take all his secrets to the grave.
Shipman committed suicide by hanging in prison on the 13th of January 2004. It was the day before his 58th birthday. So again, it was Shipman being in control and doing what he wanted and playing God, deciding who lived and who died and when.
And when you have someone like Shipman with his arrogance in prison, I'm not surprised at all that he committed suicide. I would be shocked if he was going to live in prison, living the life of an inmate. He couldn't do it. He was too grandiose, too narcissistic, way too arrogant, and he just killed himself.
Harold Shipman never showed any remorse for the murder of all these people. He never discussed his involvement in the deaths. He never apologised to any of the families, and he decided to take the circumstances and what had happened with him when he committed suicide.
Even in death, Shipman continued to haunt the country. A sixth and final report was published by the inquiry in January 2005.
The Shipman inquiry found that he'd begun killing as early as 1971, while he was still training as a doctor. He'd not even become a doctor and he was already killing. The inquiry found that he was responsible for as many as 15 deaths at Pontefract General Infirmary, possibly including that of a 4-year-old girl.
Shipman's suicide in January 2004 means that hundreds of family members may never know what happened to their loved ones. It was the final callous act in a callous career.
There's always this problem about the word evil, isn't there? How you attach that to somebody. But if anybody's evil, I think he's evil. Yes, right. To go around killing people in cold blood, apparently just for the pleasure of it.
It was a doctor who's supposed to look after you, who's supposed to care for you, who's supposed to save your life, not take it. And I think, you know, as a nation, that really resonated. If it could happen in Hyde, such a close-knit community where families still live next door to each other and looked after each other, then it can happen anywhere.
Probably there aren't many people who'd lived in Hyde for a generation who didn't know somebody who'd been killed by him.
It is hard to picture Harold Shipman as a cold-blooded killer, but that's exactly what he was. He was meant to care for people, but instead he was murdering them for no other reason than his own self-gratification. His insatiable appetite for death spurred Shipman on to take the lives of over 215 innocent and vulnerable victims. He is, without doubt, one of the world's most evil killers.